Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we explore the theories that we think may have a shot at changing the way we understand our world in the future. And to that end, they may explain how we see the past in a very different way as well. We are meeting up with Ben from UnchartedX today to talk about anomalous artifacts from the early period of Egypt. So before the classical period, when we see pyramids, when we see pharaohs and all of the things we associate with Egypt, there is a strange period where there are rather primitive grave sites found, but they contain these very strange artifacts that we can roughly class as wares, but particularly vases. Anastasia is holding up a replica of one of these that was actually sent to us generously by Matt Bell, who's going to come on the show soon to talk more about the subject. And
I feel very Vanna White right now.
They look rather ordinary on their surface in our modern world, but the devil's in the details, as they say. And Ben and his colleagues have gone to extraordinary lengths to measure and scan and try to understand the precision of the manufacturing that went into these vases. And it's pretty mind-bending. We're talking about micron level precision. We're talking about tooling processes that boggle the mind, even using today's standards and today's technological innovations. So the question becomes, who were these people that were making these vases, and why are they ending up in these primitive grave sites completely out of place in the history? It also cracks open this enormous question of the linearity of history. Is it really true that history just stretches from the primitive to the technological present, or is it a bit more nuanced and complex? Does it perhaps make switchbacks? Are we facing potential of that in the future ourselves? So this is an extremely exciting conversation, and I'm really, really stoked to share this with you guys.
In the theme of exploring the ideas that we think are going to change the world, we are hosting a big event this summer in Portugal. And when you hear Portugal, you might be like, oh man, that's really far. I've never traveled out of the country. Maybe I haven't traveled recently in a long time. Maybe you're looking at the geopolitical situation and you're a little bit worried about what travel will look like. But I think that in our age of increasing alienation from one another, where we're all sitting behind computer screens and we're watching the world unfold, there's actually nothing better than having people come together with a shared purpose. And the shared purpose that we have this summer is that we are going to explore what happens beyond the Big Bang. And we have gathered our favorite scientists that are trying to figure out what the James Webb data is saying about the world, what other possible theories might fit it, and what that tells us about the birth and evolution of the universe. We have people like Alexander Unziker and Gareth Samuel who have their own incredible YouTube channels where they explore alternative physics. We have representatives of the plasma cosmology world like Eric Lerner, who is kind of the OG of this world because he wrote a book called The Big Bang Never Happened in the 90s and is working on a plasma fusion project right now in New Jersey. We have a bunch of academics, and we're going to bring everybody together not for a debate where one person rises victorious. It's going to be a weekend of talks, panels, discussions, poster sessions about what the future might look like, which theories work where, and how should we start to reimagine the way that we understand the universe. And the best part of it is that it gives you a reason to travel because it's not just going to a place and going to the tourist destinations and then buying some tchotchkes and heading home. This is an opportunity to interact with the people who you've been listening to and reading and following for years. It's an opportunity to meet other people who have your shared interests and spend the afternoon hanging out with them and talking about your favorite nerdiest subjects. We're structuring the weekend so we have talks in the mornings and then we have panels and discussions at night over dinner. Everything is taking place at a really nice seaside hotel where every single room has an ocean view, the food's gourmet, the settings are beautiful, the company is going to be great. And so if you can make it out to Portugal this summer, links are available here. If you can make it out to Portugal this summer, tickets are available here. They're also in the description, and we would absolutely love to see you there. It's going to be fantastic.
And remember, this entire project is supported by listeners directly. That means we don't sell stuff that we didn't make, and we want to keep it that way. So come over and check out patreon.com/DemystifySci and see if you can give the tiniest little piece off of your paycheck every month to make sure that we can put more and more time towards this project. And if you do that, then you can come and join our weekly discussion group. We meet every week, Sunday mornings, face to face, and talk about all the ways that we could do this project better, what's interesting in the world of theories, and where should we be headed next.
And for now, enjoy our conversation with Ben from UnchartedX, and we will see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I'm super excited to get into it. I mean, oops, I forgot to bring our vases over to the show today.
We can grab them at halftime.
Yeah, we'll grab
If
them
you
later.
need, I have a bunch up here. I actually have, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16 different 3D prints.
I'm actually going to grab mine just because it'll be good to break it out.
You know, everybody wants to have their own vases to show off. Everybody has a vase.
Yeah, Matt Bell was kind enough to. I think he's selling the prints of his vases now, but he basically printed off his whole collection at the time as it was like a year or so ago, and then sent me one of each. And then I've just collected for some reason a whole bunch of the what I call the OG vase, the first one. People have given them to me. They've printed them at home. It's what's weird is I've actually signed a whole bunch of them that people ask me to sign. I don't know why, but yeah.
Everybody wants an artifact, man. That totally checks
True.
out. I love how
We got the
compelling they are as objects.
Yes.
There's just something about it. It's just so like clean and neat and timeless, and just you look at it and you're like, wow, that's really nice.
Yeah, there's layers to them as well. That's what I found. I mean, they've always fascinated people, right? I mean, the vases. I think they've always captured people's attention. People, particularly people that have any sort of engineering or machining approach to this stuff. They've always looked at these going, these are like this. They look precise. They look like why do you make them out of granite and these really hard types of stones that it's just stupidly difficult to work. And then once we start peeling back the layers of the onion, they just seem to get more and more complex, and they're just encoding a bunch of data. I mean, if you've read, I hope you guys should have read. I hope you read Mark Vist's article. He's a fascinating guy. He's the guy on unsigned.io that sort of uncovered some of the what seems to be mathematical design that's behind them, which is just, I don't know how else to explain it. It's not a coincidence. So
Before we get all the way deep into the specifics, Shiloh and I were standing around talking this morning as we were drinking coffee, and we were both sort of realizing that we're not very well versed in the timelines of Egyptology and the vases and what people in the mainstream claim versus what the people who have experience with machining claim. And I wonder if we could start with a fairly broad 30,000 foot view of what it is we're looking at. Because as soon as you start to go into Wikipedia and trying to figure out, what are these timelines? When do things begin? I was really amused because the vases are considered to be like pre-dynastic objects.
a lot of them, yeah.
But then if you go to the Wikipedia page and you start to look at, okay, like what is pre-dynastic? It literally, the top of the page is like, okay, well, it's a time period that starts 300,000 BC and ends at 3000 BC.
It's pretty funny, actually. In the new Egyptian museum, the GEM, the Grand Egyptian Museum, they take it back even further. They literally, I think, on the walls like 700 pre-dynastic period, 700,000 years ago.
Good Lord.
To like whatever, 3,000, rough 3,100 BC, right? So timeline, and I actually don't think there's any real disagreement here. Certainly not from me about the official timelines of the vases. There's some areas that are a bit spotty. In terms of how far back they go. There's definitely some controversy around how far back they go.
What is the official timeline for that? Can you catch us up to speed on what the story is anyways?
Well, sure. The vases in general, this is one of the reasons that I think they're such an interesting class of artifacts and why they, to me at least, we can get into the reasons why I think they represent a big smoking gun. in terms of, sort of significantly advanced technology being required or being in use at some point in the distant past. It's because they're pre-dynastic, right? This isn't controversial to say they're pre-dynastic. You can go to pretty much any museum in the world that'll have a pre-dynastic section. They're going to have these vases.
And so I'm sorry to interrupt you again.
Time period, yeah.
Yeah, it's like for people on the street, like pre-dynastic just means like before the pyramids or something. What?
So what we would term dynastic Egypt. So we think of dynastic Egypt as, it's essentially a 3,000-year-old civilization that starts with Dynasty 1 and it ends at the 26th, 28th, up to the 30th, around 30 dynasties, broken up into different periods of time. You have the Old Kingdom. You have intermediate periods, you have the Middle Kingdom, more intermediate pyramids, New Kingdom, Ptolemaic times, Greek Roman times, late period. At the very early part there's something called the Archaic period, which is essentially the first two dynasties. But this all kicks off roughly 3100 BC is the date, right? So that's
and that's like when people think of Egypt, like they think of pharaohs and pyramids and mummies and stuff. Like this is what they're talking about.
Technically, it's actually the first unification of Egypt, because even before that time, you had people behaving like essentially dynastic Egyptians. There were cities, like they were fairly, there was a lot of society. It wasn't just straight cavemen to ancient Egypt. There was a progression, but so there were cities, but the first dynasty was considered really the first unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the two major kingdoms in Egypt. And then your intermediate periods are when that breaks apart, right? So that's like there's conflict and dynastic Egypt. And we have a pretty good handle on the history of dynastic Egypt. I don't dispute any of this. Like I think there's there's lots of written records. We're pretty good at interpreting hieroglyphs. We have lists of the kings that lived during the dynastic period. Although it's interesting, there are also lists of kings that go back well and truly, literally tens of thousands of years prior to that time. However, in the orthodox mainstream version of history, dynastic Egypt starts around 3100 BC. So pre-dynastic is pretty much referring to time before that. Now, immediately before that, you have some cultures, essentially they're referred to as like Naqada cultures. There's Naqada 1, 2, and 3, and they might run for like 1,000 years or plus. It gets a little hazy the further back you go, but there are these pre-dynastic cultures, and they're fairly primitive, right? This is the thing. We've got burials from them. You can go to the Nubian Museum in Aswan is a great example. They literally have recreated Naqada era, burials. This is before they started burying people in boxes or in mastabas and things like that. So it's shallow burials, fetal position skeletons, bones and beads like fishbone combs, and very primitive artifacts and things like primitive pottery. This is after the Stone Age, but they were doing pottery, but it was primitive pottery. It's hand thrown. There's no wheel involved with it. And mixed in amongst all of these primitive artifacts and primitive burials, they have found hard stone vases and dish, not just vases either. There's dishes, there's square things, there's plates, bowls. It's vases. I use the term vases because most of the interesting artifacts we've looked at are vases. However, there are other items that very much fit the same set of characteristics.
Are we talking like this is in the 4,000 to 5,000 BC area?
Yeah, pretty much, right? So let's say a couple thousand years prior. So more than 5,000 years ago. So 6,000-7,000 years ago. In that area, that's where it's really not controversial at all to say these things are pre-dynastic. And this is go to Cairo Museum. Any museum with a decent pre-dynastic section, you will see these vases: basalt, granite, porphyry. It's not, and this is everyone agrees. Now, I actually think, and we're getting to the bottom of this, and this has been one of the things that has certainly been controversial that I've talked about and other people have too, is that I think there's evidence for these things going back to potentially as far as 14 or 15,000 years ago, because there are obviously these cultures go further back in time, particularly in southern Egypt, what the region known as Kush today, northern Sudan, southern Egypt. And you have burials there that really are carbon-14 dated, going back, say, 15,000 years, and in between like 10,000 to that period. Sort of similar burials to the Naqada culture, like primitive, very primitive burials, filled with primitive artifacts. And again, you see hard stone vases and objects in these burials. Now, there's less evidence for this because a lot of these essentially these excavations took place 1904, 1905. It was Harvard, it was Boston University. They did a lot of these things. Really, a lot of the only evidence that we have for this are photographs of these burials, like black and white photographs that are on display right now in the Aswan Museum in Luxor. There's like a temporary display. It's been there for a couple of years, but it's these photographs of these sites, and in these photographs you can see hard stone vases. You see the pottery, the primitive pottery. You see this hard stone plates and dishes. Some of them you can actually see the stone, the surface. Like you can see the patina of the stone. You can see it granite and things like that.
How similar are these to the pre-dynastic vases?
Same thing.
Okay,
Same
and
thing.
so
the vases, they look to be the same thing.
And so the archaeologists who find these in the early 1900s are just kind of like, well, that's curious, and then they just kind of move on. Like, is there any record?
There is. So there's some record, and actually, to be honest, it's something we're going to get to the bottom of, because people have gone, that's not what these photos say, and you debate, go back and forth. I actually think there is other points here that really do show. I'll say two things. There's other things in these burials that I think prove the fact that there are hard stone objects in these burials. I also think it doesn't matter, which we'll get into why I think it doesn't matter, because pre-dynastic's pre-dynastic. You have the same set of problems for the kind of the mainstream story, because you're talking about primitive people that didn't have the capability to make these things. There's no other evidence of stone, whether it's 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 BC, or it's 10 to 13,000 BC. There's literally no evidence of any other type of stonework in these cultures. Like, there's no statuary, there's no advanced architecture, there's nothing. Yet these things turn up, and they are significantly challenging to make. And they just don't seem to match any of the other. They're very out of place. They don't match anything else in these burials. These cultures don't seem to have that capability.
Can I ask a really stupid question? I should probably know the answer to already, but were they still making these in the height of Egyptian culture in the classical period? Were they making these kind of? Yeah, okay. So that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. This is a big part of this, is that they stop in the Old Kingdom. So they extend from, you go pre-dynastic, and then they pretty much go up to the 3rd and 4th dynasty. That's about it. And then you have a couple of individual exceptions that might be dated to slightly later times. Generally because there's some hieroglyphs scratched into it. But again, this is one of those problems with the way that dating works. If there's writing on an object, you can quite literally tell. I can show you 100 examples of literally, it's vandalism. It's chicken scratch. Someone's taken a chisel to this amazing hard stone artifact that's made with precision, and they've just hammered a name into it, and they go, well, if it's that dude's name, then he must have had it made. It's just archaeology in general isn't engineering. Like, one of my problems with it, I think they're not interested in how these things are manufactured. They never really have been. They're more interested in what's written on it, what did it contain, what role did it play in the social structure, in the daily life of people. There's very little legitimate, I think, archaeological interest or research been put into how these things were manufactured. There's nuance here with what happened after the hard stone vessels sort of died out, because the Egyptians did keep making vases. They made alabaster vases, which it's calcite. It's very soft, it's like marble, a little softer than marble. And it's much easier to work. It's a 3, 2.5, 3 on the Mohs scale of hardness. You can work it with copper tools and flint. It's very easy. And then there's a whole industry that spawns pretty much after the 3rd and 4th dynasty of these alabaster vessels, which are beautiful stone, right? It's just white stone. It's got veins through it. It's a gorgeous stone. And they make these vessels, yet you can go and look at these vessels, and you'll find that they very much match what essentially a primitive culture making them with flint-tipped tools and sticks and rubbing on them with stones. They're not precise, they're wonky, they're not symmetrical, they don't have any of the same attributes as of the hard stone vessels. And this is what continues all the way through to the end of the Egyptian civilization, these alabaster vessels. And it becomes a high art form, they're beautiful, there's tons of them, but they just didn't. It's weird. You have this precision industry with very difficult stone that seems to have existed at some point that was then replaced by an essentially very simple industry with very primitive tools, making far inferior from being a precision perspective artifacts from a single type of much softer stone. And they know all about this because it was literally this is an acknowledged fact also in archaeology, that this process was developed by Imhotep, who was a polymath, right? He's this genius craftsman. He's credited with designing the step pyramid for Pharaoh Djoser in the Third Dynasty. And Imhotep came up with a process to essentially imitate the hardstone vessels in alabaster. And it's credited to him. And they draw scenes of this process on the wall. Like you literally go, and this is, Flint Dibble, for example, likes to point at this and go, well, this is how they made all the vessels. And that's not actually what the archaeologists or the Egyptologists say. It's specifically the process used to imitate them in alabaster. And
how convenient is it that the Egyptians were so obsessed, had a kind of graphomania where they were just illustrating the things that they were doing in permanent ways? Like, few civilizations have left such a record.
It's true, yeah, and it's wonderful. And this is one of my I think the points that can be made about this and about other sort of really complex or precise or massive artifacts is that there's no depictions of that. Like they don't show us. There is zero depictions or written records of building pyramids, of the big stone pyramids. There is of the mud brick pyramids. Like that is depicted. You can go to the tombs of the nobles north on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, and you'll see this in one of the tombs of the nobles. They're making mud bricks and they're stacking them up either to make mud brick ramps or to make mud brick pyramids. We have depictions of them using primitive, bent sticks with flint tips and weights on them that they would spin to make alabaster vases. You have woodworking, tons of that, like tons of scenes of them doing woodworking and other sort of, clay and pottery and all this stuff. But you have nothing of them making hardstone vases. There's nothing about them making massive stone pyramids. There's nothing about them making 100-ton single-piece granite boxes. There's nothing about them making 1,000-ton single-piece granite statues, of which there are several. Nothing about moving those 1,000+ ton statues 1,000 miles or 1,000 kilometers, of which there are examples, a couple. There's some achievements that happened back then that really, is sort of encompassed within dynastic Egypt. It happened in Egypt. Certainly later kings wrote their names on some of these things, and we just go, well, if Ramses II put his name on it, then he obviously made it. It's a simplified view, although, again, this has contradictions even in Egyptology and archaeology, that they know that a lot of this stuff is essentially defaced and inherited because you have the names, and some objects had names of like 4 or 5 different pharaohs over a 400 or 500 year period on them. We don't really know who made it. It's just whoever wrote their name on it. And the vases connected this stuff. What was interesting about the vases to me is because they die out. It's because they stop so early, right? It's like they're small artifacts, right? That you can be buried with a vase. I think if you are a primitive culture and you come across, so you find one, or you dig up an earlier burial, you find this hardstone vase. But you're a primitive culture. You're using stone tools. You're making pottery. I think you would intrinsically recognize the value and significance of this thing. You'd be like, "This is amazing. This is made from granite. I don't know how you did this. We know it's the stone type. It's hard. It's the form and functionality of this pottery stuff we're doing. It becomes valuable, and it makes its way up through a social structure to the kings or warlords or whoever's at the top of the tribe. He gets buried with them, and they're gone. You can't do that with a 100-ton stone box. You can't do that with a 600-ton statue. So these things stay on sites. The sites get inherited over thousands of years. They get reworked, they get renovated. These kings come along with all their hubris after generations of these kings. And of course, like in the New Kingdom, the 19th dynasty, 18th, like super, super powerful. Egypt had a lot of wealth. They're winning wars. And these guys, these pharaohs were pretty arrogant. And it's like, well, okay, this is a depiction of the god. It's going to be me now, put my name on it and carve my name in really deeply. And I think that's, honestly, you boil it down to a basic explanation. I think that's a legitimate interpretation of a lot of the stuff that we see. on these sites, that you have to look at them through this lens of thousands of years of renovation, rebuilding, rebranding, inheritance, and just the potential for longer timelines is there. And the vases kind of show that because they're non-controversially, unequivocally pre-dynastic. They do exist up into the early period of the Old Kingdom, but we know they go further back. And how far further back, we're not sure. That just to come back to that, those 15,000-year-old burials, the archaeology, the reports of them talk about wares. They're not specific. It's like stoneware, ceramic ware. We don't really know. However, I can say this is that some of and there's really nothing on the internet to find out. However, the definite records and the artifacts that are found in some of these burials, some of that stuff is still at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. We do have an appointment to go there later this year in a few months. We are going to find out. Like, there's just nothing you can see online about it. And we want to get to the bottom of it. Also, in those older pictures, here's another sort of meta point about the vessels, is that you find imitation hard stone vessels in terms of their pottery. And this, again, is an acknowledged aspect of these pre-dynastic and early dynastic cultures. And this, again, this is in museums. British Museum has great examples of this. So does Cairo and the New Museum. But you can find like these pottery vessels that are painted to look like stone. They'll have the dots on them to make them look like granite, for example, or they'll have these swirls on them to imitate the swirls of limestone breccia. And it's an acknowledged. You look at the little plaque next to it, it says, well, the hardstone vases are really expensive, and for normal people, if they wanted to have the magical properties of this, this amazing thing in the afterlife, you could get a pottery one, and they would paint it up to make it look like the hardstone one, and it would magically supply the benefits of this in the afterlife. It's acknowledged that these are imitation vessels. In fact, you can put them right next to each other. And I've got some great photos of this where you see, here's a granite vessel, and here's a pottery one that's a little bigger, but it's painted, and it's like a replica, but in pottery. And I
imagine dudes were selling these just like they sell counterfeit Louis Vuitton purses now. It's just like a guy with a rug.
You want a Rolex, kid?
Yeah. You want a Rolex? Yeah, from Hong Kong, which is a special one. Yeah, I think I have one. I lived in Singapore for a couple of years. I'm pretty sure I've got an imitation one.
Can I ask like a 30,000-foot question about this? I don't know if this is the right time to get into this, but is there... Okay, I know infinitely more about like the Mesopotamian story than I do about Egypt. And in that case, there's a story to be constructed where there's a mythological memory of their ancestors. And whether that's the Anuna and the Tash Tepe culture, or it's in the Indus Valley civilization, there's all of these little threads that you can chase back where you're like, where the hell did these language isolates come from? Who are these people who just spring into, this fully fledged civilization all of a sudden? And you can kind of reconstruct some sort of mythological memory. And there's a flood story there, and there's all this stuff.
Yep.
Is there anything that the classic Egyptians point to that could be interpreted as a memory of this precursors? I don't want to call it a civilization, but whatever you want to call it, precursor culture that had this much more advanced technology than than you would find in the grave sites otherwise.
100%. Very similar, actually. A lot of the I think between the Sumerian story and the Egyptian story. So yes, there's. You hit on some of the points as well that are, I think, some of the contradictions in Egypt. I think it don't exist in Sumeria, like cuneiform, for example. There's kind of a process where you can see cuneiform develop over time, from my understanding of Sumerian. Hieroglyphics are a little different. That just seems to pop up out of nowhere and it's like, boom, done. Like, here's this really complicated, extremely expressive language that's written form that's insanely difficult, but it just sort of pops out of nowhere. There's no real precursors to it that we know of. Sort of like the pyramids, the first pyramids they ever built were these giant stone ones that are still standing, like largest things that we've ever built, just about. Anyway, but yes, there are stories and parallels. Like there is a kings, like the Sumerian kings list I know goes back a lot further, but there is a story and they talk about these times that before the dynastic eras. There's goes back some. There's a kings list, for example, from a couple different sources. There's the Turin Papyrus. Menaeho, the priest who wrote in Egyptica, one of his books, he talks about it as well. But they have a king's list that stretches back, say, 40,000 years. and it goes into times. Have you heard the term Zep-Tepi? No. So Zep-Tepi was like the first. It's like this primordial time, and they talk about that time as a period when the gods themselves walked the earth. And these gods are often described as having these kind of mystical, magical abilities. And of course, this is where that old quote comes in that any, science that isn't sufficiently understood is currently indistinguishable from magic. You can look at this potentially through the lens of like, well, they're describing a cultural memory of potentially technology, but it's in a culture now where the only explanation for it is magic, and that these people are gods. They could fly, they could do this or do that. And that period existed, I think, for like 20,000, something like this, 20,000 years, and then is followed by the time of the Shemsu Hor, or the followers of Horus, who are again these semi-divine, magical, mystical beings that had all of these powers and abilities that are more or less described as magic in the Egyptian stories. And along with that, they also do have their own flood myths. There's a really interesting flood myth that talks about Hathor essentially getting mad and drowning everyone. This like all of their ancestors they drowned. They had to put the other gods had to get together to put her to sleep to stop her from killing everybody. The world was put into darkness, and then Thoth Jehoti, the god of wisdom, had to teach men to be civilized again. So they do have kind of this cataclysmic story. Maybe this relates to the Younger Dryas. I don't know.
Did you say it was a goddess who taught the men to be civilized?
No, Thoth, the Jehoti, the god of wisdom. He's often the ibis-headed god, or he has two forms. He's also a baboon. He's also one of the original gods. Like he's one of the oldest and long term. And it's, these. I'm not that well versed on the pantheons, but these gods get sort of direct translations down into the Greek and Roman gods, and the pantheons they sort of continue through time as different deities with different names. But
it's really interesting to consider the flood story, because one version of the flood story is the Younger Dryas event, right?
Yep.
Huge bolide explosion, the seas roil, they overtake the people, and the aftermath is everything that is encoded in these myths. But it's also possible that it's like a dramatization of the oceans rising to take over everything, right? Because if you have lower sea levels and everybody is living in these seaside towns, all of civilization rings the waters, and then we have 300 feet of sea level rise, which I can imagine could actually probably happen catastrophically, because if you have a sufficiently large glacier calving, or if you have some kind of bolide explosion that's over an ice sheet and the ice sheet starts to melt and all of that gets deposited at once, like I can imagine that happening not over the course of, 5,000 years, but happening over the course of maybe like 50?
The glacial dams too, right?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, the Great Glacial Lake Missoula. I know a lot about this. Is if you guys, I don't know if you ever had Randall Carlson on as a guest. They're great. If you ever want to get into the details of this, I recommend. He's a fantastic guest to have on this. And any other topic, actually, Randall's basically a genius. He's some sort of wizard. I'm pretty sure, but yes, and we know this happened, right? If you actually dive into like the details of that sea level rise, you have these meltwater pulses. They're like 1A and 1B, and 1B kind of correlates almost bang on exactly with. I think it's the beginning of the Younger Dryas period, so 12,800 years ago. And then the sea level does rise, I don't know how much, but it's like even 80, 70, 80 feet in a really short period of time. That's catastrophic. I mean, we can't imagine it. But over that period of time at the end of the Pleistocene into the Holocene, we did get this roughly 300 to 400 feet of sea level rise. And yeah, it changed the surface of the Earth. I mean, it's literally millions and millions of square miles of land went underwater. Doggerland, you have Sunderland, you have these huge areas that are potentially areas for civilization. There's some other interesting corollaries, particularly for the Middle Eastern flood records that come down through Christianity and all the religions of the book. I'm not always sure that these stories, if you assume they're correlated to a particular cosmic event or some sort of massive flooding event, I'm not sure they're always correlated to the Younger Dryas. A lot of people seem to think that if there was a precursor civilization, it's like, well, it was one that probably ended with the Younger Dryas. Personally, I think that the potential for much longer timelines are there. We've had to be quite honest, roughly 10,000 years of really nice weather on the planet, probably the best and most stable weather and climate that we've had for almost probably millions of years. Because if you go back past the Younger Dryas with these big spikes in, temperature and big swings and sea level rises and changes, you go into like the Bolling-Alerod period prior to that. There's the Elder Dryas period prior to that, and these all seem to be pretty catastrophic. Although nothing to the extent of the Younger Dryas. That seems to be the worst thing that has happened to the planet in, say, the last 5 million years.
Well, it would have to be really old, right? Because it's like if memories are maintained in the form of myth about something fairly recent, like this flooding event, for instance, it's like how much time does it take for people to forget how the pyramids were built? I'm moving like away from the Wikipedia story of how the pyramids were built, but let's just stick to the vases. And we should definitely like spend some time building out the case for these vases being of a higher level of technology. But how does the memory of that, like you have this moment where the Greeks are showing up in like 500 BC at the earliest, trying to figure out how the pyramids were built. Like they have no memory of that. There's no like records, like you said, there's no diagrams, there's no discussions about this. How long does it take to forget something in the background of which myths about something 10,000 years ago, like the flooding or the sea level rises, are apparent in all of these different cultures? So it's like we can remember stuff a really long time ago, but for some reason, these processes that resulted in these vases, or dare I say the pyramids, seem to have been completely forgotten.
It is interesting. Yes, and I think that a lot of... I actually have a video called like Myths, Gods, and the Younger Dryas Cataclysm that kind of dives into this. I think the evidence for cultural memory of cataclysm. And I think cataclysm is probably a bigger thing to remember than, say, a smaller cult, like an individual area or person or group of people building pyramids. But you see how cataclysm kind of works, right? And it gets, and this is are you familiar with Hamlet's Mill, for example, like the book Hamlet's? Okay, so
I tried really hard to read that book.
Yeah, me too. It's read Graham Hancock's summary in Fingerprints of the Gods.
That's what I ended up doing. This was like in my early 20s. I tried really hard, but
yeah, it's a tough read. Yes, I can't say that I've read it all the way through either. I understand its gist. How I like the idea of this idea of encoding data through oral tales and traditions, but they obviously get deified in these stories. It's like you can't just tell people, okay, a great year is, or a processional year is 26,000, whatever the number is, 26,000 years. It gets deified, and these stories are built up around it in the way to pass down information. Similarly to whether this culture died from fires, which we know happened as a result of the Younger Dryas, or flooding, which was another big one. It's one of the two, it seems. And that information gets carried down and buried. I often wonder about how long it takes to forget, real information. Because I think if the Younger Dryas, touch wood, it doesn't happen. But say that happens tomorrow, and it does end our civilization, but humanity survives. We have small pockets of isolated humanity. How many generations do you think it would be? We're sitting around a campfire, we're telling stories about cell phones and plasma TVs. And I wonder, like, at what point do you start getting a black rock and making it look like one of these, and you're dancing around a fire trying to initialize it or to make it work? Because if you do the right thing, then this thing has the ability. You could talk to your ancestors, you get information about anything on the world. It can, it has all these capabilities that within a few generations we're now thinking are magic.
Okay, so what's crazy about that is the cargo cults.
Yes.
After effects after World War II, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was going to bring up just isolation too, and what happens when you're in a specialized civilization after a catastrophe, because I go to the grocery store to get my food, right? Like, I'm going to die if the grocery stores stop working. Probably. I'll do my best. Like, I'm going to hang on as hard as I can.
He might actually die sooner than most others because he doesn't have a lot of reserves in the tank.
Yeah, that's true. But you think of who's going to survive a catastrophe on Earth today? It's like uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, super hardcore backwoods hillbillies maybe, but the people who know how to build semiconductors and fabricate computers, right? You might just be so
really needed anymore.
Exactly. So so people have isolated themselves from the processes that prop up their civilization, by and large, the people who are capable of actually surviving the collapse of the civilization might not be the people of that civilization, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so there you have easy forgetting of all sorts of incredible bordering on magical technologies, because the people that are going to survive didn't use it in the first place anyways.
Well, I have the sneaking suspicion that survival is actually dependent upon you not using the technology and not being a part of that elite crew, but that's kind of a rabbit hole. We don't have to go in that direction.
Or unless you elite, and then you're in the bunkers with the...
That's true, but you need somebody to supply the bunker over a long enough period of time.
True. Yeah, eventually it's going to be the Fallout model. You'll have to open it up and come out and join the chaos that's happening on the ground. Yes, I agree with all of that. I think about the same thing. It's the generalists, and I love this idea of what happens to a cultural memory of, say, technology over time. And honestly, this is why some of these temples, you go to like Dendera Temple or the Abydos Temple of Seti I, and these spectacular, totally either New Kingdom Ptolemaic constructions. Like, yes, this is built by the dynastic Egyptians, no question. But walls are just covered with these just fascinating depictions of these figures that are using these devices. Like every was staff, right? These staffs that they hold has this little shaped thing on the top. It's called a was. It typically signifies power. And then on the bottom of it, every single staff has a tuning fork. And then there's other scenes where they're holding these devices that they're projecting, or it looks like things in their hands, or there's the handbag thing that happens in Samaria. And there's a part of me, and it just gets more and more ornate and complicated as you go down through the dynasties and sort of the New Kingdom and the Ptolemaic era. It's beautiful artwork. It's incredible. But I do wonder, are we looking at what is essentially, or possibly, the remnants of a cultural memory of technology and actual capabilities, things that did stuff, basically cell phones, whatever. But it's been filtered through literally thousands of years of ceremony, of religion, of structure, of the, this whole system been built up around it, of the priesthood and this ritualization and this,
the cargo cult's can you explain that to people really quickly, the cargo cult thing? Because that makes a lot of sense in this context.
From my understanding of it, it was that there were Pacific Islanders that during World War II benefited enormously from the material wealth of the empires that were fighting wars in the Pacific. And so they built airstrips, they would have cargo planes that would come and they would bring supplies and they would give them to the villagers. And these are villagers that are living on tiny spits of land in the middle of the ocean. Like, they've never seen the wealth of what the American hegemon can produce, and it's just being brought out of these airplanes on pallets, and then the war ends and they leave. And anthropologists who come to the islands later find that the tribes are building effigies of the planes in the hopes of getting them to return.
But they're like not real planes. They don't understand the mechanics of it, so they're just making things that look like planes.
They're building them out of like canvas and wooden sticks. Like they're not planes. They're shaped like planes.
It's the shiny black rock that if you dance around the fire correctly, it might activate. It's a similar thing. I actually do describe Egypt as I think it's a potentially the biggest cargo cult civilization out there. I think to me, Egypt, it got a kickstart. Like they began. I think a legitimate interpretation of the Egyptian civilization. And I've yet to find stuff that really rules this out. I think it's a legitimate interpretation of the evidence to suggest that Egypt did get a kickstart. They inherited a lot of gear and artifacts, architecture potentially, and that their timelines are longer. It's literally what they themselves say about their own culture. And it explains, I think, a lot more adequately the massive contradictions inherent in that culture, particularly the Old Kingdom, right? And the Vase is a part of this, but it's the biggest contradiction to me. It's like the pyramids and the granite work and all this stuff. It all is the best stuff's the oldest stuff. The biggest and most complex stuff tends to be the oldest stuff. And it just pops up out of nowhere. And there's just, you dig into the details of it, there's huge contradiction. Like a lot of Egypt, the majority of Egyptologists and archaeologists do not credit the Old Kingdom Egyptians with the ability to quarry granite. Yet you go to Giza, I don't know if you guys have been, but go to the Giza Plateau and you just go and stand in front of the Valley Temple. And there's a whole bunch, and there's actually the Pyramid Temple, the Sphinx Temple, same thing. You've got these massive granite blocks, 70, 80 tons, all fit together with mortarless joins. You can't even see the joins in places. It's precision work, but it's also massive work. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of tons of granite involved just on the Giza Plateau. Like literally the middle pyramid, the bottom two courses are granite. The third pyramid, there's even the smaller one, mostly we know 17, 18 courses of that are granite. The huge stone. You can't get that granite from surface granite. That's what they say. Oh, this was granite they found laying around. It's just not. You talk to a geologist about it, they're like, this is stupid. No, you cannot get big lumps of granite like that from surface granite. It's fractured and you have to dig down, and that's why you go to the quarries, things like the obelisk. You know, they've cut the top off a granite mountain, they've quarried down to get to solid granite where you can get big pieces like that. Anyway, and it just seems to pop up out of nowhere. And the same thing, I think, exists in a lot of even the New Kingdom temples, Karnak, Luxor, the cores of those temples. And we know that they existed in the Old Kingdom. But the cores of those temples, the oldest parts, are made from granite, massive granite. And it's just not what happens with the rebuilding later on. They're built out of sandstone. They're not built from single pieces. They're blocks that they've stacked up, things like this. There's a lot of contradictions. I just think an explanation that does explain all of these contradictions, as well as a lot of this technological evidence, is the idea that, yeah, maybe they did inherit some of this stuff. I don't think it's that of a crazy thing.
I mean, I guess people like cynics who are listening to this might be like, well, where is the evidence of these people when they're actually building these things? Do you think that it's underwater?
Yeah. Potentially, I don't know. Tools. I mean, I do get the question frequently, and it's a valid question. Like, where are the tools? I mean, the Egyptians themselves have records and talk about these precursor cultures, but yeah, we've not found any, and we've not found any tools. Who knows where they are? I think a lot of the people that suggest the tools thing also don't really have a good understanding, particularly if things are metal, about. And if we're talking about timelines that are potentially tens of thousands, if not even longer, hundreds of thousands, again, we know that the extension of the human timeline puts human beings, Homo sapiens sapien, as potentially 800,000 years old now. Like the DNA studies on teeth morphology. Certainly the oldest fossil record is still, I think, the jawbone in Morocco. That's like 310,000 years. But DNA studies and teeth morphology, things like that, suggest that we could be as old as 800,000 years.
Which really, really screws with you when you start to think about the fact that the earliest evidence of complex culture, like burials and ceremonial abstractions, is like 40 or 50,000 years old. And you're like, right, what are we doing for all of that time? There's no genetic
Especially
change.
like cave paintings and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Like abstract representations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's clearly something insane in that gap. And they call it the sapient paradox. And it's like, well, that's a little weird. And you have all these people that are trying to fill it where they're like, well, they found mushrooms. We had a guy yesterday who's like, well, they started getting bitten by snakes and so identified themselves as the eye for the first time. And you're like, I don't know, maybe. And Shiloh made this really interesting point in the aftermath of that conversation where during the conversation, he was like, well, our archaeological record is stunningly spotty. Like the number of sites that we have to fill in that gap is tiny.
Yeah, there's just, the Younger Dryas happened. That's one of the biggest problems here. It literally changed the surface of the earth. I mean, in a lot of places, it's the new world. They call it the New World. It's built on the ruins of the Old World. Go over if you want to see the power of the events that happened during this time. I mean, go to the Channeled Scablands in eastern Washington State and look at what happened there. I mean, it literally scoured the surface of the planet, and that happened in a lot of places. So, yeah. So why don't we see tools or remains? We have this really scant archaeological record. I had big problems with the same thing, the idea that we could be hundreds of thousands of years old, yet the great leap forward, this cultural representation, the idea of ritualistically burying dead, 50,000 years ago, but civilization itself, 6,000 years ago, we're still on that figure, despite Göbekli Tepe and I think that the Tas Tepler civilization, I think that should be changing, I hope, but even then, 10,000, 12,000 years, there was a gap, right? You look at our culture, we went from horse-drawn carts to space shuttles within a couple hundred years. Like, it seems like humans give them enough food to eat, some warm weather, and we start solving problems in rapid fashion. And we know that humans like us existed for hundreds of thousands of years. So I struggle to see why it's so improbable or implausible that civilizations could have arisen.
I think
during that
it's
time
because
and
it's
been wiped out.
horrifying.
Well, yeah, there's a
I think that it's like, I cannot imagine a deeper source of existential dread than this being
Yep.
true.
this is why I'm writing a book about it, because and something I don't talk about very often is I do think it's actually important to try and figure this out, because I do, and this is a fundamental belief I've developed over time, is that I think it's important, because this idea that we've gone from the Stone Age to striped toothpaste inside of 6,000 years is this fundamental tenet of what it means to be a modern human. We just think that, okay, this is modern civilization. This is the way that it happens. It's preordained. Don't worry about it. Like, this is the only way this can happen. And I think that's just this built into us. Like, you don't have to know much about history to have that built into you from a very early age. It's in the school system. And I wonder what would happen if we could change that. If it's like a change in the zeitgeist. If we change that to something that's more cyclical, okay, we're on this cycle between civilization and cataclysm, and on a long enough time scale, this is guaranteed to happen again. We have this example of where it's potentially happened in the past. We want to avoid that. Would that change our mentality? Would it change our behavior?
Especially if it's
how we interact with each other.
Especially if it's a self-induced cataclysm, right? Like, what if it's purely social? Like, what if what happens is you get this Pareto distribution of wealth, and everything's going great for a while until you basically alienate most of the population, and in some, you basically concentrate all the wealth, and what if it's just like this purely social phenomenon?
I think that it has to be a social phenomenon married to a material one. Because, and I think that this is tied to the energetics of civilization. Have you ever read any Vaclav Smil?
No.
So Vaclav Smil is this sinecured academic that teaches at like the University of Minnesota or something. And he's basically spent the last 50 years just writing about energy and civilization. And he's like, energy is always the limiting factor of every single civilization, because you have to figure out how to get stuff done. And when you don't have stuff to burn, you're using people or animals. And as you figure out how to find progressively more and more energy dense things to burn, then you can move away from that and you can do more things. And so there's this transition where you have to be able to go from burning things to something like nuclear power, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And if you fuck up that transition and you consume all of your burnable resources before you make the step, because of what Shiloh's saying, that you screw up the social structure in such a way that the machinery becomes so unstable that you can't keep it moving forward, you actually end up in a position where you have consumed all of the hydrocarbons that are easily accessible. And I do think they're renewable, but I think that they're renewable on the order of millions of years.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, our bones will become hydrocarbons one day, right? It's
Can I just add that it doesn't have to just be like greedy people at the top like taking all the money or anything. Like, it can literally just be a mistake in the way that you manage wealth. Like, in our civilization, there's a really interesting feature that's developed in recent decades where the financial structures skim money off the top without actually providing goods and services. And so you could just have like literally the equivalent of a bureaucratic mistake that just runs your civilization into the ground. Like, it could be some tiny little stupid thing like that.
It's the equivalent of the fungus that infects the ant and makes it crawl to the top of the grass to then further infect the next ant.
Yep. It is. No, you're right. These are all the Kardashev civilization types and the gatekeeping steps that you have to go through to get through that. I'm familiar with a lot of that type of thinking. I think it's true. I do think that if we could put a different idea into people's head about where we are on this, and it might be a cyclical nature, we're in a really unique position right now. Like it's like we've used a lot of those hydrocarbons, and we've had the nice weather, and we've built up this technological base where we can actually start to think about solving some of the true long-term problems to get us into that next phase. Because ultimately, what is it? The only answer for our civilization or our species is to get off the planet. It has to be to spread out in the long term. There's no other, long enough time.
Everything
There's going to be
else.
another rock. Yeah, another rock will hit this planet, and then truly long enough time frame, it's done when the sun goes. But yeah, it's. I think that it'd be an interesting idea to think about what happens if you could change that perception, and I think there's precedent for it too. Like I do think that, and this is like, agree with it, don't agree with it. The people that are listening will go one way or the other when you say words like climate change. But it's a good example of how a concept has in the last 20 or 30 years altered our behavior, right? It's like climate change is this concept it's changed the zeitgeist of humanity. It changes our investment decisions. It changes our interaction with each other, with the planet, probably all for the better ultimately. So I think it's possible you could do this. And I just, ultimately it's altruistic, and it might be overly optimistic, but I just wonder if it wouldn't help us to spend a bit more money on things like space exploration, solving the longer term problems, and a little less money on tanks and guns and fighting each other in the next political cycle. Like I think that's the message, and one of the reasons why I think this whole investigation is kind of important work. It's one of the things that drives me about it a little bit and gives it a bit of purpose for me.
Yeah, maybe the asteroid mining stuff will displace the incentive structures there a little bit. I think war is extremely profitable right now. Like if you're an industrialist and you want to make money, it's like, God, first of all, just the money that you can make destroying a place, and then the money you can make rebuilding it afterwards. It's just, there's nothing like that on the planet that makes you money like that. And so, there are some cool reports though about these asteroids maybe having, a whole global GDP's worth of rare earths or something. Like I could see that being incentivized in the future. I hope so.
I swing back and forth between pessimism and optimism for the future of humanity. I mean, I look down the road. It's a really simple equation. It's like when I was a kid, there was 3 dudes on the garbage truck. Now it's 1 dude and a robot. I know that our societal structure, it's like technology moves forward, but our system of society and governance really hasn't changed at all for a couple hundred years. And I don't see it has to. And as you said, we're slowly segregating and concentrating wealth at one end, and we're squeezing middle classes everywhere. We're making, a lot more of, I guess, of the poor classes, and there's not going to be enough jobs, and the whole way the whole society functions to me is like, and this is going to take, it has that establishment inertia. It's going to take a long time to crumble, and we'll fight it crumbling. But I feel like our social order and structure is essentially circling the drain. It might take a few centuries yet, but we have to get through that step. This is one of those big gatekeeping moments for civilizations to progress. Technology keeps going. It simultaneously frees us and enslaves us. It enables us, but it's also used against us. So I look at the future of humanity. It's like, well, if we don't screw this up, then we've got a shot. But it's like, I feel like our system as it runs today isn't sustainable. It can't continue like this indefinitely. So at some point, that it'll crack. And what happens then? I don't know.
Or you get faced with some crazy natural disaster, whether it's the younger whether it's a bolide exploding over Manhattan or whatever. If you get pressurized, then you have to arrive at a solution or collapse much faster than you might already be on track to do in the first place. So it's kind of, there's an element of chaos to all this as well. And I think that's important when you think about something like the idea of the Younger Dryas impact theory is, it doesn't have to necessarily wipe out all the humans. It just has to disturb their natural cycles in such a way that they can't maintain whatever they were getting comfy doing beforehand.
Yeah. And it's crazy, and this is one of the Christopher Hitchens quote. It's like that we may well not be the end of the evolutionary chain here. Like we're just intended to give birth to the thing that's going to actually overcome these challenges. we're just at the end of the day greater primates that learned how to talk. I mean, we've still got really big adrenal glands, and we're very emotional, and we make stupid decisions. We're very warlike. It is a bit of chaos. At the same time, it's also, I think, a fun time to be alive, because to me, I was a technologist for 20 years. That was my background. It's just, I feel like we're in the absolute wild, wild west, early days of technology. Like, we've just gotten started. Like the scope of where this could go in the next century is astonishing. Like, we'll see. And it's very difficult to predict. I mean, I don't have a lot of good predictions because it keeps changing. We'll see where the AI stuff goes. I mean, that seems to have the possibility to be as significant a game changer as the internet was. I mean, and that, it's hard to quantify these days because we're so used to that. But I mean, that the internet alone just completely changed how almost everybody lives.
Yeah, 50 years from now, we won't spend 8 hours a day on the computer.
Hopefully.
It'll be 45 hours a day.
Yeah, only 8. I feel like lately I'm editing this video at the moment. It's just dawn till dusk. It's terrible.
God, you said something really interesting earlier where you were wondering about the way that ancient peoples encoded their knowledge of technology in myths. And so what would it look like if everything fell apart? And we had stories of these objects. And it makes me think of two things. One is being an Italian growing up in the shadow of the ruins of the Roman Empire, where you know that something happened, and you know that it fell, and you know that these were your people, and it's still kind of recent enough that you recognize that it was like a high watermark of civilization. And if there wasn't a culture that was organized around maintaining that story, it would be really easy for that stuff to get lost and grown over the way that, like, the pyramids in Mesoamerica did, where people only find them through, this like kind of weird practice of archaeology where there's Europeans that are like, oh, we're very curious about what these things are, and so they kind of unbury it. That's one thing. And the other thing that I think about is the way that these ancient myths, if we assume that there are ancient myths that have survived from the makers of the vases, it was hard for me to imagine that those makers didn't see the end coming, or didn't put some kind of seed of some lesson that they were trying to convey to the future.
I wonder if they did that or not. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. It does to some extent feel like they may well have known it was coming. There seems to have been some preparatory measures taken. If you look at things like underground cities, Derinkuyu, and several others, that's a potential response. The other thing is that makes me think they may not have seen it coming is that one of the aspects of a lot of the most mysterious sites and the artifacts and architecture that seem to show what I would call sort of significant advanced ancient technology is that they're unfinished. There's a lot, and you pretty much see this time and time and time again, where there was a moment where these things weren't quite finished, and there was a tools down moment, and it just stops. You see this at the Assyrian in Abydos. You see this on the pyramids. You see this in the Serapeum at Saqqara. It's really all over the place. This idea that something happened and work stopped. And we know that later, I mean, it still is unfinished today, but even then you get some of these sites that get inherited and then they get, inscripted by the dynastic Egyptians, and they add more work to it, but it's a different quality of work. It's a different type of architecture. The original core part of it is still always unfinished. So,
do those tools down moments afford any insight into the process that was?
Well, they do. It's one of the most fascinating things. One of the valuable parts about unfinished work is you can actually see examples of what the tool actually left, because a lot of times, things like machining marks get polished out in the finished product, but there's a number of individual examples where you can see, and I think, again, these are really smoking gun pieces of evidence for machining, where you can literally see what this tool did, and you know that it's not the intended result because it's unfinished, and you can see the finished stuff right next to it. Probably one of the best examples of that, to be honest, is there's a big granite box on the island of on Elephantine Island at Aswan in Egypt that is this phenomenal single piece. In fact, I can probably show you a picture of it. Phenomenal single piece granite shrine thing, but it has these delicate granite bull noses all over it, and then one section of the bull nose has it's essentially it's been faceted. It's a semicircular bull nose, but there's this unsectioned part, unfinished part of it that has just been faceted, and it's just there's some tool.
Do you have a picture of it? Can you pull it up for us?
I do.
We can edit this afterwards. So take a minute. Don't worry about it. I know it's really hard to talk and scroll around on your computer at the same time.
Yes, let me see if I have an overall picture of it. So this is a good example. So this is like the bullnose on this box. If you can see this.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And you see the faceting. Like it's literally these straight lines. And it ends up here somewhere. And this is not the result that you would get with a chisel. Like if you were trying to hammer this, apart from this being rose granite and being insanely tough stone, you wouldn't if you were trying to shape this thing roughly in a semicircular fashion. This is not how you would do it with a chisel. There's been a tool that had probably a rotating tip, and I've had literally just craftsmen, machinists, engineers, artists. Almer Allen came on a trip with us. He's like a New York Times artist. He's had profiles written on him. His work sells for big money, but he works in stone, in metal, in other materials. He used to do everything by hand. And then he developed carpal tunnel, and then he tried to use hand power tools, and that was too difficult for him still. So today he works with like 3D CNC machines, 5-axis CADs. So he's an expert in all forms of machining, essentially, like from primitive to advanced in stonework. And he looked at this and said, "Forget it. Like this is machined. Like you just wouldn't get this result." And this is the transition point you can see here. So this is where it's faceting, and then this is what the rest of the bullnose looks like. It's just rounded off. So they just hadn't polished out these faceting marks, but it's a good example of something that you just look. This wasn't done with a chisel. This is some other process was used to make this, and you just have lots of other examples like that. There's saw cuts. There's tubular drills. There's specific machining marks that really don't correlate, and they bear no resemblance to the primitive techniques, the ways that the archaeologists explain stuff. It's like, well, it's all pretty much all boils down to grinding. When you're talking about hard stone like granite or basalt, they say, well, they got copper or horn or other stone tools, and they put sand in it because sand, has little pieces of flint or corundum or whatever, and they just would grind. And yes, you can grind through stone. People have been doing that for millennia, but the results you get are not at all like what we see. That's where the nuance is. It's some people accuse me of saying you can't cut stone or you can't get through stone with copper or with other tools. I've never said that. You can. You're using the copper as a sacrificial material against sand that has quartz and corundum in it. That's doing the grinding and the cutting. But it takes days and days to make a cut this deep, like you're just grinding away. And there's been some experiments done looking at the rate of granite removal and all of this sort of stuff. It's just none of the results from those experiments look anything like the ancient examples that we see. There's some other technique involved here, and it gets particularly fascinating when you get into some of the specific machining marks, things like tubular drills.
Yeah, what is that?
So tubular drills, we have these are these holes that have been cut. Here's a good example. This is like small tubular drills that have been cut down.
So they're like little rings for people who are listening. Like it's just kind of these like rings inside of this trench.
It's still a mechanism that's used today. It's a this is a good example of one here. It's a tubular drill. It's a hollow drill that cuts into material. So you're left with a core that it snaps out, and then there actually are cores that have been found. So this is an example of a core. This is quite a famous core. It's called Petrie's core. Flinders Petrie found this in the late 1800s. And it has these you see that groove that's on it? It has this clearly defined groove. And so you can analyze this groove. There's been a lot of research done on this particular
Is that one
core.
granite, by the way?
Yes, it's rose granite. Yep. So this has come out of a hole in rose granite. And what's interesting is the analysis of the spiral groove, the machining marks on that hole. And by the way, these holes get a lot bigger. So some of them get up to 9-10 inches. This is me sitting next to, in rose granite, a half of a hole. That's a huge hole. And in fact, there's even bigger ones than that. There's ones I've seen nearly up to 2 feet now. but massive, and this is very difficult material to try and grind through. And if you're looking closely at the edge here, I don't know if you can see it, it's difficult to see, but the tool tip in these holes, you can see that the actual, the tool was very thin. So it's very precise, it's very thin. And with these tubular drills, one of the things that's been found about them, and this has sort of been geometrically proven by a guy named Chris Dunn, this is a latex molding of that Petrie core. And so what he's done is he's essentially notched this core is like a round tube of latex, and he notched it down a center line. This is like the B and D points, so it's these notch details. Then he cut the core essentially down in between these notches, right? So you have to imagine this as wrapping around and being this truncated cone, but you see the notch detail at A and at B, they lined up, and then so you can trace these lines. And they start at the notch, and then they end up below the notch. And they start at the notch, they end up below the notch. So these are actually spiral. They're not horizontal grooves. So whatever was making this cut was penetrating into the stone fairly rapidly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it's Petrie noticed this, and he calculated it to be like a 1 in 60 penetration rate. So think of it, if you unwind that circular motion to a horizontal motion, for each 60 inches of horizontal travel, you get 1 inch of vertical travel, which, to be frank, is an astonishing penetration rate into material like granite. In fact, it happens to be about 500 times greater than anything we can achieve today. Our tools run very high speed, like they're really high speed ceramic, and they kind of grind through granite. They're not cutting through granite like this seems to have been. And this may have worked slowly. We don't know how fast it went. But
what's the just to like steelman the mainstream perspective on this? Is the idea that they had these copper tipped tubes that they were just kind of doing this with, or something?
Yeah. There's actually been experiments, and look, it works. You can get copper tubes, you get sand, and you put a bow drill on it, back and forth. Although I struggle to realize how that scales up to holes like 9-10 inches in diameter, but. Yes,
lots of slaves, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of work. And so they've done this experiment. A guy named Dennis Stocks, who's an experimental archaeologist, also with Mark Lehner and Roger Hopkins, who's a stonemason. They did a series in the, I think, late 90s for the PBS Nova called Secrets of the Obelisk or something. And they did some of these experiments, which I think is a good thing. We should be experimenting. A lot of other people, by the way, have done this experiment now where you grind with a copper tube. And you grind, so you'd spend a few days, you cut about this far, and then you can stick a chisel in there and hammer it and snap this core out. And the core, when it comes out, though, it doesn't look anything like the ancient cores. It's polished. You're essentially polishing it with this grinding with sand motion. And by the way, you're chewing up a lot of copper. Like, you lose a lot of these experiments. They have documented how much copper they lose during the process. It's humongous, which is a whole other interesting discussion when it gets to the industrial scale of some of the granite work that happened in Egypt, because this is the same mechanism is used to describe how they cut through the big blocks too, like a copper drag bar with sand instead of a spiral copper tube. And not for nothing, but they have found precisely 0 of these from ancient Egypt. The where are the tools discussion is like they've found there's no depictions of this. They don't show how they did it. There's no depictions of it. They found 0 copper tubes or copper drag bars. No evidence for it at all. It's literally speculation on the parts of the Egyptologists, and then they've done some experiments. They kind of look at it and go, see, this is how you do it, and then they just declare victory. But any analysis of the actual tool marks, machining marks, it isn't anything like it. And this is why engineers and machinists who know this stuff are typically really interested by it, because you're seeing evidence for some significantly interesting and advanced technology that's cutting through very hard stone. We don't know what the mechanism was. It doesn't seem to, it may be, who knows what, it could be ultrasonic. There's lots of speculation in this area about what it could have been, but the evidence is there that, they did it, and then you see the sort of proof of how fast they cut through it, not only in the tubular drills, but also in the saw marks and stuff you see in granite and basalt as well. So, it's fascinating, and engineers, this is why I think it's an important angle on this stuff that isn't really considered by the Egyptologists.
What do you think is the most compelling explanation for how they did it?
I have a suspicion. There's a couple. I think ultrasonics is a possibility. So if we do ultrasonic drilling today, There was an interesting interview with a guy named Jeffrey Appling, who's a jeweler who can use, this is a really small scale, but you get like steel rods and you can cut like almost like the sword in the stone kind of deal. If you vibrate that tooltip at the right frequency, you can use that and it'll sort of sink into very hard stone. And then if you stop vibrating, it's like locked in there. That's a possibility. Although Chris Dunn, in his research, I credit Chris Dunn with being the modern day. He's the one who's progressed the work of Flinders Petrie the most. Flinders Petrie being the first guy, I think, that applied modern engineering techniques that came up out of the industrial age to the mysteries in Egypt. I think Chris Dunn he kind of thought about the ultrasonics thing and then he stepped back from it. He said his later research seems to think he's disproved that concept. Thermal lance is another possibility. Then you get into like really crazy ideas like molecular stone softening. Like somehow you're changing the properties of the stone so it's not as hard as it normally is.
Isn't that I'm surprised you think that one's super crazy. Aren't there people in South America who do that still to this day? From what I understand,
so there's a theory. Yeah, so there's a theory. It's like the bird vomit or poop or whatever. There's a certain
some sort of plant. I thought I'd have to read.
It's a combination. I can't remember the details either, but it sort of softens just on the surface of stone. It does degrade stone. I don't think it really applies to these big giant cuts and deep holes. I don't think it's penetrating like that. It's very mechanical. There's definitely a mechanical element involved with this. I actually think in places, particularly like South America, the idea of some form of molecular stone, so we're changing the properties of the stone itself. Honestly, intuition tells you that seems to be what's going on because it's in South America and the Sacred Valley. I just got back from there. It's crazy. Like that's your intuition tells you that. I just have nothing. I have no evidence to support it other than intuition. Like I just don't understand it. We don't, as far as I know, we don't know of any method that could possibly do this. But I don't think it's crazy. I just think it's difficult to suggest as an answer because we just don't have any real evidence or support for it. I do think it's possible. Part of a broader point on this technology. I think one of the problems we have is that and this is the academic world. I think tends and anthropologists, Egyptologists tend to look at everything in the past as a subset of what we know today, like a subset of our technology. All you have to do is look at our own culture to know that in 100 years, 1,000 years, we're going to know more about science, about technology, which immediately informs you that, yes, there are whole realms of science and technology that we're either just beginning to explore, we don't know anything about yet. And I think we should always consider the possibility that some of these answers may lay in those realms today, like outside of our current perspective. And I think if we approach these problems with an open mind, we might end up learning something about them. We might get closer to the truth. I'm sure we'll find lots of crazy ideas that get discarded along the way, but I don't think it serves anybody by simply just stating, look, they did this by grinding on it with copper because, that's the answer and it has to be a subset of our technology that fits this primitive idea of these people. I don't think it serves anything by just doing that. And that's unfortunately where a lot of the dialogue is right now because the vases are changing this though. So
how would we do it today? Like if we wanted to drill one of these, what would be the process? Would we use what is I don't know anything about drilling, honestly. I think they use hydraulics or air compressors to run these drill tips.
A bit of both. Well, you can get a big ceramic drill bit or something that works on stone or tile, diamond tipped usually, and you can just run at a high speed and it'll grind through it. It's not ever going to be a 1 in 60 rate. Like I said, this 1 in 60 rate's about 500 times greater than the tools we would use today. However, our tools work quickly because they spin it in like 900 RPM or whatever, right? So we would do that. And if it's a big enough tool, you might need compressed air to blow it out. You would definitely need some weight on the top. This is funny because Petrie himself, you could tell if you read between the lines with Petrie. Now, Petrie didn't have Flinders Petrie. I'm talking about the pioneer Egyptologist, the first guy I think to really apply these engineering techniques from the industrial age. You can read between the lines. He didn't have the context of a younger Dryas or a longer timeline, but you could still see where he was really confused by what he was seeing and sort of suggesting that there's something else going on. And one of those areas was these tubular drills, because he talks about, well, maybe it was like a bronze tube with like embedded jewel points because it's cutting. And he said, well, and even then for like a 4-inch tubular drill, you'd probably need at least 2 or 3 tons of pressure on this tube to cut through it. And I'm like, really? If you look at these holes, they're very like millimeter thickness tubes. You put 2 tons of pressure on a 2 millimeter thick bronze tube and try and turn it, it's just going to fold. Like, it's not going to, you just can't, none of it makes sense. And he was sort of, I think he, in his way, was admitting, yeah, this doesn't make sense.
I mean, another way to approach it would be like how to spin the thing really fast. And I wonder if you could just imagine some steampunk mechanism, like literally like steam pressure to turn a turbine that would rotate your shaft, or something that's like doesn't require necessarily space age technology, but is outside the box of what we would be thinking of.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, look, early lathes were water powered. I mean, the rise of precision in the modern world literally came from the need for naval cannons to shoot straighter. Like they started, and they would hollow that. They figured out a process of using a water wheel to turn a cut, a tooltip to cut a straighter hole through a big blank of metal to make a naval cannon that cuts straighter. So it's a possibility, but you still end up with this. You're in this position with these things where it's just the rate of cutting is the challenge. Like, it's the tool marks that are left from it. So grinding or anything that runs even at a high speed still isn't going to penetrate through the stone at this rate. So you end up with this, a polished surface. And I mean, there's even studies that were done by Penn State in the 80s, did a study where they did a bunch of different testing with a bunch of different grinding compounds on granite. They put the results under a microscope, and you can literally see, like, it looks nothing like, these ancient cores. And there's lots of these ancient cores, not just one's particularly been studied, but there's tons of them. And this, for that matter, applies to the saw cuts as well. It's really the specific machining marks that it leaves and what those indicate to a machinist or to somebody familiar with manufacturing, and the rate at which they cut through the stone. There's something else going on there. Like,
they look scooped out as the drill bit turns, as opposed to just sort of like
grinding.
Yeah,
it seems to be cutting. Yeah, and some people say, well, this gets a bit technical. I live in this world a little bit, but it's, some people say, well, that could have been inscribed when the tool tip withdrew. However, these are also conical. They're not straight, like the outs, but this way, the holes are straight, but the cores are truncated cones. So they cut more at the top. Like, so the tool tip itself is probably, the inside is also a truncated cone. Like, I think it looks to me like they had them designed for specific depths. Like, you need one that's 10 or 12 inches long or deep, or you need one that's 5 inches deep, and they would use that tool to cut down to a specific depth. Which also means if the tool tip is shaped like this, the second it is withdrawn from the hole, it stops touching the side of the core immediately, and you wouldn't have an unwinding result from the groove. It's that literally this is a debate. This particular groove on this Petrie core been going on for 150 years. There's still people that are doing everything they can to disprove it, because they just refuse to believe what it means. Personally, I think Chris Dunn closed the book on this with this latex mold that he had done at the Petrie Museum, and then his analysis of it. I mean, it's just. However, I've got some friends who were in the Petrie Museum recently, and they scanned it with structured light. They did photogrammetry on it. We've got all these models of it. I actually have a 3D printout of Petrie's core up there. So it's an ongoing thing. I think it's case closed. And the funny thing is, it's like, why is it so difficult to say that it's a spiral groove? I mean, literally, it's funny. Like, I think it was Harold and Ogilvy's textbook, one of the major textbooks in Egypt that tried to address this. They went so far to try and say this wasn't a spiral groove, that the picture they put of Petrie's core in the textbook, they just tilted it ever so slightly to make the grooves look horizontal, and they just said it's horizontal grooves from grinding. It's like, why is this a problem? It's because of the implication. It's what it means. It's like one of these dominoes. If you go, okay, it's a spiral groove, and okay, it has a 1 in 60 penetration rate. It's like, well, okay, you cannot achieve this with copper tubes and with primitive grinding methods. It has to be something else, and it starts to, the rug starts to get slowly pulled out of this idea that these guys were butt flap wearing primitives that were using sticks and stones and sand to do everything we see in ancient Egypt, which is literally how it's all explained. Sticks and stones and sand.
Is the reason that you can't get a spiral groove off of just grinding have to do with the rate of penetration?
Yeah,
I
pretty
see.
much. Yes, I can show you pictures of it. There's a Penn State study, and funnily enough, they also use that study to try and say the Petrie core is horizontal grinding grooves. In fact, the word spiral never even appears in that study. But the nice thing about that study is that I think they're showing the actual opposite. They show you these nice magnified images of these granite nubs that they've ground on. You see hair, like very fine under a microscope, like very hair fine, just circular grooves where it's just spinning at 900 RPM, but not really going down very quick, right? So you end up with this, you either polishing or these very fine horizontal striations from grinding.
Hey folks, pardon the interruption. Remember, this project is entirely supported by you, which means we work directly for you and we don't have to do anything else to sell things for people that aren't part of this project of exploring the theories of tomorrow. But we need you to come over and check us out at patreon.com/DemystifySci. Make sure that we can put more and more of our effort towards this project and make better stuff for you. Back to the conversation. People are attracted to these topics and they don't totally know why even. And like I run into this because I teach at the university, I teach astrophysics and cosmology, and it's not immediately apparent why the history of the universe really even matters. Like it's hard to put it into words, but it really does either reflect and or shape the way that we see ourselves, I think, at the end of the day, and like who we are and who we want to be in the future and what's worked out in the past and what's going to work out in the future. But it's not immediately apparent when you look at something like archaeology, like why people like literally will throw coffee in each other's faces over which story is correct,
Yeah. Yes. I get it. Yeah, it does. I think it does give, certainly for me, it's given, I've always been fascinated by history. Like I did it. I almost went that way at university. I just figured that I could, my computer obsession would probably stand a better chance of getting a job and making money doing something in history, end up staying in academia or whatever. But
practical.
My interest, yeah, right, yeah. But I was always the computer kid too. Like that was just, I was always going that way. But it's given me a lot of context over the years to frame how you live and what's important. Like I think that's a huge benefit of studying history and understanding that a lot of the things that are important to us are nothing more than trends that are going to disappear after a generation or two. Like it puts stuff in a context where you're like, it doesn't matter. Like don't worry about that. Like find what does matter to you and do that. And it's helped me with that. And plus, honestly, just fascinating. It's just nice to get to do something, and you guys probably have a similar feeling where you get to chase a passion and do it, and make it part of your life. That's super rewarding. Like I had the giant career change moment, where I quit a 20-year career that I was very successful in, and just jumped into doing what ended up being YouTube. It's like, what are you crazy? Like, but it's great. I love that these things exist, and I'm very grateful that people are at least somewhat interested in hearing about them, even to my level of detail that I end up getting into. I just can't help myself. Like that's the way I try to make content first and foremost to satisfy myself. I definitely don't try to pander to the audience. I want to be happy with what I've said about something, and before I put it out there. So, and I'm grateful that people seem to enjoy it, and it's had enough of an impact where I get to do it all the time. But yeah, I'm not trying to satisfy anybody else with it. It's just,
well, it's crazy that people, like lots of people, are into this stuff. Like people from all walks of life, not just academic people. It just has this really profound human appeal. I think there's something about ancient history and the mysteries of ancient history. It's like, I don't know if we're like, maybe we can learn something by the way people screwed it. I think it might be like kind of related to the way that people love like true crime, right? They're like, well, if I know how the serial killer thinks, like I can avoid the serial killer. Like I'll be the one that makes it out. And I feel like there's something about that with ancient history too. It's like all these people went through climate change of their own. They all went through tyrannical regimes and wars and like these processes.
And they all died.
Some faster than others.
He is in fact dead. Yeah.
Some faster than others.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I like the idea, and it's just it comes back to that why it's important thing is that I like the idea, and I like to consider the idea that there were advanced cultures, but not like ours. Like I do think that if this, call it Atlantis, whatever you want to call a precursor civilization that had these capabilities that may have been able to do this stuff, I definitely think it was very different to ours. Like I just don't think it was anything like ours. It probably wasn't as popular. It doesn't seem like there's evidence that it was as populous as ours. And I think for sure it also must have existed very much alongside a Stone Age culture, in the same way that to a much smaller degree we still exist alongside things, uncontacted tribes on the islands off of India and Pakistan and down in the Amazon and things like that. But I think it was a much higher ratio back in those days, if they existed. And it's just fun to think about, like what was that culture like? What was it? Was it different to ours? I'm sure it was different to ours. It must have been. I just think from the echoes we get through these cultures, yeah, it just doesn't seem like it would be anything like our culture specifically. Although,
but it does seem to have really tantalizing reflections of our own, right? Like we've started by talking about how beautiful these vases are. Why is an object that was made, I don't know, 15, 20, 30, 50,000 years ago still something that is so easily seen as being beautiful? Why are the sculptures in Egypt still so magnificent? Like they must have had something that is in us still. And so in some way they have a different metaphysics where their foundational principles, like the rules by which they build the world, are different. And yet they still arrive at something that's tantalizing to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of artistry, symbolism, and beauty is there. I think that I do think these are the products of humans too. I do think these are all done by human. I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm not a believer in the ancient astronaut theory, but I think it was us. I think honestly, I think there's a possibility that other types of humans could have been involved in this. Like we don't. We're the last humans left. That there were other humans.
Dude, I just learned yesterday that it was only 15,000 years ago that there was another human species on the planet.
Like Neanderthals.
We looked that up yesterday. It was it the Denisovans?
Denisovans, maybe?
Yeah, I think it was I don't know how to say that. Denisovans?
It's weird because it's a Russian word, but like it's like
Denisova cave, but I've heard people say Denisovans or Denisovans.
How do you say it? Let's ask the Russian.
Denisova.
Denisova.
But like nobody's saying that in English.
There you go. Denisovans. Yeah. And we did have a pinky bone to go with that. And look, there was, and Neanderthals, from what I understand too, we used to think that they couldn't talk, which obviously is a prerequisite for kind of building society. You should be able to communicate one with the other, but I believe that's changed now. Like I think we do now believe they have the vocal cord structure that they could speak and communicate. Lovely singing voices. I'm not sure what the study says, but
heavy metal.
Yeah, it could have been. Yeah, it seems a bit more heavy metal, doesn't it? Like large cranium, or bigger brains, all of that. So I just think there's a possibility that's and there's some evidence, particularly with the Denisovans, like that, there's that jade bracelet thing that's part of that seems to have either primitive machining or some form of machining on it. We see stuff in Turkey, these advanced, it's not like the vases from Egypt are the only example, the only place in the world that we find really old, sophisticated items. They also come out of Turkey, and they're definitely 9,000-10,000 years old. They've been machined. There's obsidian rings and vessels that really are only explained with kind of machining, things like that. So but I don't know. I think it is the output of humans though, and certainly they seem to have been encoding data into them. Like one of the things that's encoded into these vases that we've seen in multiple vases now is concepts like phi, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, like this fundamental building block of the universe. It's a constant, like in our universe, right? There's one ratio that seems that life expresses, that the universe itself expresses, hurricanes and
Snail
galaxies, snail shells, DNA. If you slice a DNA strand acrosswise, and that slice of it reflects phi.
I haven't heard that
Galaxies
one.
reflect it. Oh yeah, from as small as cross section of DNA. It's built in the same ratios. Our human body, obviously, the upper arm, lower, all those things. It's just this universal constant to me. It's like the fact that it is expressed in the vase so eloquently and just elegantly and repeatedly seems to me to be an indicator that this is information that's being transmitted about their capabilities. Like it's like this. It was really funny, the story with the vases. So the guys that when we first started the investigation, there was a couple of aerospace engineers involved in it. They work in, they're just super qualified metrologist engineers working in the aerospace industry for some of the big companies. Very focused, intelligent dudes. And, we're seeing this precision in this ancient vase. And it's just like, this is really wild and interesting. And it wasn't until Mark Visted wrote his article and discovered kind of the mathematical design behind it, which we can get into. But one aspect of that is the fact that it encodes pi and phi repeatedly within its design. Like it's there, and it was 100% designed, and it really is. I had this conversation with one of these engineers. He called me up and he said, "I have to talk to you," because it wasn't until he really understood that this thing was designed and its information is encoded in it, and these people knew about this, that he started waking up at night. Like his worldview got shifted all of a sudden. Like instead of being like, well, okay, it's precise, and maybe there's ways to explain that it's precise, but once you get to this point, well, it's like, no, this has actually been elegantly mathematically designed and executed with just insane precision, and it encodes these principles where he's just like, he's waking up at night sweating about it and thinking about it, and it's like, I can't figure this out. He said, it seems to me like this is something like the golden record on the Voyager spacecrafts, which uses symbolism and different types of language and, encoded data on these, even just on this golden disc that's attached to it in order to try and convey information to somebody, if anybody, anything finds it about us. And that's been sent off through space. And I love the analogy. He said, it feels like this is something similar that's been sent through time. It's like a permanent object that's kind of been sent through time. But if you have the eyes to see it, then you can start to decode some of this information and learn a little bit about the capabilities of its makers. And I feel like that's what these vases are, because it's kind of spooky once you get into the mathematical design behind it. There's no other conclusion.
Well, like the Greeks are famous for using the golden ratio in their architecture, from what I understand. And they're very explicit about the mathematics that go into the production of that particular aesthetic. Do we see instances of people doing that, just stumbling on aesthetics in the distant past, or is it?
You can by accident. I mean, look, if something is proportioned well, if you make a stool and it looks like to the eye it's proportioned well, it may well reflect the golden ratio specifically.
Because I always think of music or something, right? You do have to have this beautiful mathematical relationship to play a nice interval in music, but you don't necessarily have to understand it that way in order to do it, right? You could just be like, that sounds good. And I wonder if there's an equivalent in architecture or vase construction. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. I
understand. Yeah.
Could it just look good and there's something universalizing about that experience aesthetically?
So you would have to get into the details of how it's encoded, and I think we can do that, because it's not just the golden ratio itself, although that is there, but it's like the golden ratio squared is also reflected, and pi over the golden ratio squared is it's encoded in complex ways that can't really be an accident when you consider how carefully it has also been designed mathematically. So maybe it's worth diving into some of that, because this is
let's do it.
This is, to me, is like this the most revealing component of these vases, right? There's different attributes on the vases that I think are remarkable. Well, one that mostly gets talked about is the precision. So how flat is it? How circular is it? What's its concentricity, its roundness? How accurate is the relative geometry? So once you define a top and a center line of the vase, matching the sphere that matches the center of the vase. How close is that thing aligned to the center line? The lug handles, all that stuff. Like, what's the relative geometry on that thing? And it's turns out to be very, very accurate. Like, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is things like wall thickness. You have vases that have 1 or 2 millimeter wall thicknesses with stone like granite, where it's translucent. It's remarkable. Like, it's that thin-walled vase, Anastasia, you were holding up. That one, in its thinnest part, is around 2 millimeters thick. Yeah, in the center part, and it's translucent. Like the real vase, when you shine a torch in it, the light goes through it. Like, it's insane to get a material like granite down to that thin and still be whole. It's brittle. It's like, you imagine like a cube of glass. It's solid. You can probably pound it into things. It's fine. But you get a 1 millimeter thick pane of glass, then it becomes very brittle. Stone works the same way.
And I'm assuming it's uniform thickness too.
In some places, yes. In fact, in that vase, no. It's actually a band that you can literally feel. In fact, that model reflects it. If you actually run your hand on the inside, you'll feel a groove around the center on the inside.
Oh yeah,
it's a little bit
have
thinner.
That. Wow.
Yeah, that one might have it too. The beehive. Yeah. That's actually, funnily, also quite a precise vessel. That beehive one. That's another aspect of it, right? How consistent wall thickness in terms of taking multiple measurements around that thickness. Yes, that's within 1,000th of an inch. Like, it's very consistent wall thickness. That's another attribute. But the attribute I'm talking about here is the mathematical design that's behind it. So this all came from analysis of the original vase, the OG vase, I call it, the first one we looked at, and this was Mark Vist's article. However, it's important and probably very telling to understand that we also found this in multiple other vessels now. But what Mark Vist found out is that there is all of the curvatures, and in fact, maybe I can share a little slide here that might help describe this. In fact, I'll just leave it there. So he basically discovered that all of the circular features of the vase have a fixed ratio relationship with each other. Okay, so if you look at this image, you can see all of the circles that are used to make up these features of the vase, the large circle in the center, the very tiny circles that, the arcs of those circles define the curvature underneath the lip or at the top of the lug handle, things like that. So there's like 12 different sized circles here, but he discovered that they all have a fixed ratio relationship with each other. There's no arbitrary sized circles here. And there's one simple kind of elegant function, scalar function that describes this. It's called he called it the radial traversal function, defines the ratio between any of these circles. It's the square root of 6 over 2 to the power of n. So if you essentially define it, one of these circles might be radius, like circle size 0. You want to step up from that, it's to the power of 2, then it's to 3 to 4 to minus 1, minus 2, etc. So you can step up and step down, and all of these circles kind of match this one simple algorithm. It's just an equation. And these circles, as I said, range from like 1.1 millimeters up to, I think, 42.2 millimeters. And each of them fit this pattern. So it's just kind of remarkable to think that there's no arbitrary size circles, that all of the radii of all of the circular features on the vase all fit this one pattern. They can all be just defined and calculated through the radial traversal pattern.
This is really interesting because it reminds me of the way that we have drill bit sizes. Like, I'm looking at the set of circles.
Yeah. Yep.
And it makes sense that if you had some kind of measurement system,
right,
where the way that you have 3/8 of an inch and 5/16 of an inch,
yep,
and whatever, like those measurements are kind of absurd, but they're still part of this system. Yeah.
So what it suggests is that there was a mechanism, or at least this is the design, like that they were using this some sort of standard for how they designed the vase, like in terms of the size of the ratio between the sizes of them. And you have to contrast this at all times, everything I'm saying about this, against the mainstream explanation for these pre-dynastic vessels, and this is a pre-dynastic vessel, that there's some dude was rubbing on this with rocks and sticks and sand for a long time. Like, it's literally an artisan eyeballing it, and he's rubbing on a piece of granite with stone and sand. Like, that's how they explain it. So
okay.
Not only, so you have this, go ahead.
So I was just going to ask, of the vases that you have measured, do these patterns appear in all of them, or is this specific ratio just in this vase and
No.
a smaller subset?
There is a smaller subset. So we have not done the mathematics. So this is in at least 3.
Okay.
3 of the most precise vases that have been studied. And there is an effort underway to kind of standardize the process to try and find this out. But I put it this way, the only other vases that have been put through this process so far, but after the first one, the same exact radial traversal pattern has been found to exist. And it's not, and so it's kind of like, so that's huge. And also the same thing applies to the phi and the pi, the encoded data that's significant ratios, which we'll get to. But what's interesting, so Mark finds this out about this thing, right? He's like, wow, okay, it looks like all these circles fit this one equation. So it's like, how accurate is it though? And so what he did, I love this part. He went into CAD and he built a model of the vase using the radial traversal pattern. So it's not a scan of the vase; it's a mathematical model in CAD built purely from the maths. And then he compared the mathematical model to the actual scan of the vase. The median radial deviation is like 9 microns.
That's pretty wild.
It's crazy. It means that this, that's at that point you're at the limit of like the scan resolution. We don't know if it's errors in the scan. Like it's basically pretty much exactly bang on to the mathematical. It means that not only does this thing look like it was designed mathematically, but it was also executed with just astonishing precision. And so, this is the point. This can't be the result of random chance. Like this has to be. The only conclusion is that this was designed and then it was executed with just remarkable precision. It's completely consistent microscopic precision that's been implemented across 12 different radii with fixed ratios in granite. Like it's actually ridiculous how sophisticated this truly is. And as I mentioned, I'll share this as well.
These are by the way found in these tombs from the the late pre-dynastic period, so like 5,000-6,000.
Yes, yeah, at least 5,000, probably a little more than 5,000 years old. These are defined by that first vase. It doesn't have great provenance, which is one of the criticisms that people levy against it. However, I can show you examples of it's pretty much defined by form and shape. It's almost identical to other vases that I've seen in pre-dynastic collections. So it's always been classified as a pre-dynastic vase.
And where do people, like, what's the mainstream conception of the level of mathematical prowess of these peoples from that time period?
For sure, very limited. Like things like phi, the golden ratio, pi, they're all attributed to the Greeks in later times. It's not supposed to have been known at all. I don't know how far they go with the mathematics of pre-dynastic people. I think the Egyptians started to show some sophistication. I'm not sure at what point they got to things like that, but typically it's the Greeks that get credited with most of these concepts, and Pythagoras and triangle geometry. It's all sort of Greek. But we seems that this stuff was known and it had existed. So what's interesting about that radial traversal pattern is we also found it in the other 2 vases. The one that you're holding, Anastasia, the thin-walled vase, is also designed with radial traversal. All of the curvatures shown in these images here are, again, within 0.05% kind of deal, like less than 0.1%. They're all accurate to within less than 0.1% of the radial traversal pattern. All of the features of both of these 2 vases, this sort of spinner vase, the flat one, and then the thin-walled vase show it. So it's quite remarkable. There's a whole bunch of other concepts that are in here, things like radians. It looks like they used radians to define angles. There's the use of the 1 radian arc in multiple vases that we find. I think that's shown here. Yeah, so the top of the vase is defined with the 1 radian arc. We see radians also used in other vases. The 1 radian arc. So it's just if people don't know what a radian is, it's just like a simple, elegant, more elegant method of defining angles than our sort of 360-degree system. It's if you take the radius of a circle and apply it to the circumference of the circle, and the pi slice that cuts out is like 1 radian. So half a circle is pi radians, and there's 2 pi radians in a full circle, 360 degrees. So that one radian.
Man, you just did a way better job than any of my math teachers ever did of explaining the radian. That was actually incredible. That is
cool.
right on though.
I do it in some of these presentations, so I've gotten used to trying to explain the radian. But so let me cover the other aspect. I'm sorry. Go.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. I just want to catch up on the mainstream perspective on this too. Do people think that they just had like potter's wheels and they were grinding these things down, or like how in the world? What's the standard? Is there a standard explanation?
No. There's not even there's not even evidence for a potter's wheel because the pottery of the time was not spun.
It was like coil?
Handmade, yeah. Like it's just handmade. However you do it, like hand thrown.
Like pinch pots? Like
yeah.
Well, you can do like coil. You like roll coils and then you like assemble them and then you gradually pinch them around the edges. And yeah, it's like super.
But how do you do that with granite?
So, okay, so with the granite, it's even weirder because it has those ears. It has the handles, and so if it was handleless, I could be like, okay, lathes, like wheels, kind of maybe, but the handles really throw you for a loop because it's like, okay, well, explain how you get little itty bitty ears on something like that.
Well, this is a very good point because yes, so some people know. So this is a good example of the goalposts have kind of shifted. Like this, not really engaged. Like we're working on. I hope eventually this argument will make its way into academia. There has been some commentary offered on it by guys like Flint Dibble, which is, to be frank, pretty laughable. And I'm making my next video that gets into that. I'm not sort of blaming him for that. I just genuinely don't. He's not an engineer. I mean, he's just not a machine. He doesn't understand. He doesn't have a lot to offer on these topics. His explanation for it was kind of funny, but I don't think he's got the expertise to offer a real opinion on it. So, but eventually, I think it is going to force its way into the academic discussion because, look, the long story short, there's a lot of legitimacy now behind the Vase scan project. We are getting into museums. The wheels are in motion for much bigger things in 2025. I can't really say. I'm sort of limited in what I can say about it. Yeah, big things that hopefully are happening. And one of the at least the internet discussions that have happened around this there has been a pretty strong element of goalpost shifting that's occurred. It has moved from these are artisans that rubbed on them with sticks and rocks and sand to so they had primitive lathes. They must have had lathes, and there's big problems with that assertion as well. For starters, you cannot achieve the levels of precision that we see in these things with primitive lathes. Like you generally need in machining terms a device that is capable of 10 times the precision, or the device itself has to be about 10 times as precise than the target precision you're going for. So this means, precision bearings and set screws and rods, and, it has to be massively stable and heavy when you're talking about granite, because, a lot of times just trying to hold that granite steady while you're working on it because it's so hard is a huge challenge. Like the intractable nature of the material itself is a massive challenge. It's one of the reasons we don't do this stuff in granite. Nobody works in granite for fun. It's really, really difficult to work in. And as you said, yes, you cannot explain all the features of the vases with just a lathe. And so I dived into this with several people, and we actually did some extra analysis of the scans, looking at how you would do this. So if you were to do this on a lathe, let's say you would machine the body of the vase, and you'd leave a bullnose around the edge where those lug handles were, right? So then you have to come back with another tool and remove that bullnose to leave you those little lug handles. Now, we do this sort of multi-step or multi-process machining in manufacturing systems today, aerospace industry, all this sort of stuff. When we do this, there is like something that's called a loss of positional calibration. So you when you change tooltips and processes, you kind of lose that very fine positioning. And so there's a acknowledged and expected drop in precision when that happens, and we build that into our processes today. So when we do design and we make parts that go in jet engines or whatever, this is an expected result, and it's sort of planned for, and it's a result of our kind of processes and mechanisms. We don't see that in the vases. So there is no perceivable lack of precision or drop in precision when you look at like things like the area of the vase body between the lug handles, which presumably would have had to have been removed with a different process if this was made on a lathe, if it was made on a lathe. The only other way to explain it in a machining perspective is that you need a machine with 5 axes of freedom to basically make this thing a single pass, like a single process.
But
Which
that's
now
crazy.
Now we're talking about 5-axis CNC mills.
Right. That's, I mean,
I was also going to say, like the
The only
CNC
way we
mills,
can make them today.
and we're usually like carving something like aluminum or something
Yep.
that's not granite.
yeah. Can a CNC mill do granite?
You can. It's going to cost you an absolute fortune because you will burn up those tooltips very rapidly while working in granite. It is possible. You can look. That is how we can we make them today? Yes. Can we could, but it would take our best machines and our best people, and it would be extremely expensive. And to be honest, Adam Young did this experiment, right? He took a simple one of his vases without lug handles, and he said he got the scan, and he took it to a granite processing company that have had more than 100 years machining granite. They have 5-axis machines. They have these precision lathes, and he said, make me one of these in rose granite, not in plastic or in aluminum, whatever. He said, make me one in rose granite, get it as close as you can to this scan. And they did that. They used a 5-axis machine to make it. And it was still between 20 and 50 times less precise than the ancient example. He had the results scanned, and they tried as best they could. And again, this was just the external surface. They didn't do the inside. They just core drilled out the inside. They didn't try to do things like, well, make it perfect, match the inside, machine the inside out so that it's within 1,000th of the same thickness everywhere, which is like the ancient examples and all that sort of stuff. They just tried to do the external surface, and at the end of the day, again, 10 to 50 times less precise.
Okay. So what about geopolymers?
I don't think. I think there's some interesting work that's been done in geopolymers, but I don't believe that has. I don't think you can explain igneous rock at all with geopolymer. I actually don't think you can do limestone either, for that matter. Maybe the most promising application for geopolymers seems to be the andesitic rock that's at places like Tiwanaku, and even then, you see machining marks and precision. I think there's huge problems with the geopolymer theory. I think it's an interesting one. I do not think you can use it to explain any igneous rock like granite, particularly something like granite, which is basically a matrix of different minerals that are bonded together at the atomic level. Like it's mica, hornblende, silica, quartz and it's literally takes millions of years of heat and pressure, and these things get bonded together at the molecular level, and then you get things like crystal growth inside the stone. Like you literally have quartz crystal growth happening. And it's not like you can make that up and just throw in some quartz crystals and it's a powder that you mix with water and it turns into granite. It's just not how that stuff works. I do not buy it for a second for any of the granite stuff. Plus, we have quarries. We literally have quarries. You go to the unfinished obelisk in Aswan, it's a 1,100-ton obelisk that's attached to the bedrock. We have quarries all over the place. We've got, around the back of the middle pyramids and limestone quarry, you can see where they were cutting blocks out.
But the way that it's attached to the bedrock is really crazy though, right? Like it does look like there's some kind of processing of the stone it's not chisel marks on it.
No, that's a whole other mystery too. That's the scoop marks. Yeah, there's something to that. And
because I don't know if you've seen this guy's work, Marcel Foti.
Yeah, I know.
I know that Graham Hancock just featured him on his website, and
he's put a book out. Yeah,
I don't know if he's right. I tend to come at these theories from the perspective of, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty much my approach on this one too. I don't know if he's right either. I certainly don't. Look, and again, I think it's an interesting theory. I actually, it's a pure geopolymer concept of like, send me a bag of it, like you can make a fortune in the landscaping industry if you can just have some sort of granite mix that I can mix with water and turn into granite, sure.
He's got a really annoyingly difficult process that requires mixing it under high temperature, like the powdered
natron.
rock with natron, and then cooking it in fire. And so
And he's got some pretty cool pictures of from some of these murals, frescoes of the Egyptians doing interesting looking stuff.
Like, it's a cool presentation.
Yeah, I have watched some of his stuff. I just don't look. Is it possible? Sure. I mean, the Roman concrete was a mystery for a long time. I think it's one we might have figured out now, but it's certainly possible that there are ways to do this. I just don't. I think there's big problems with it. Just from the perspective of we have in Egypt, we have quarries, limestone, granite. We have quarries. Like we have every block's a different shape and size. Which means, we do geopolymer today. They're called bricks, and everyone's the same shape and size because you have one mold and you make 1 million bricks. And you have 2.3 million or 2.5 million blocks of stone in the Great Pyramid. Every single one is a different block and size. That's 2.5 million molds that you need to make. And we literally have, and not only that, but look, the limestone, it's full of fossils. It's nummulitic limestone. It's full of nummelites. Like you can literally see the structured and strated layers of limestone in that stone, and it's full of these fossils. I mean, some people have suggested, well, the ancient Egyptians were. I literally saw this comment someone made. It's like, oh no, they're doing that just to try and fool us today. See, they were laying it down and throwing in fossils to try and mess with us. I'm like, really? You're stretching it. This is emerging. This is like flat Earth territory where we're just, Anyway,
even the geopolymer, by the way, it doesn't really get you off the hook in terms of the precision. Like,
exactly.
Okay, so they're injection molding. Like, how the hell are they doing that too, or what's going on?
They got to make precision molds then, right?
Right.
If you don't get away from precision, and you certainly don't get away from machining, because there's evidence of machining marks, and we see that even at places like Tiwanaku in Bolivia, which is, I think, has the strongest evidence, if you want to say that, for potential geopolymer, even though there's also quarries for that stone. I just think it's got a ways to go. And, there's other elements because I get the geopolymer theory comes up a lot to me, and I can show you a number of different granite artifacts in Egypt that have big veins of pink granite inside of black granite, or, just veins of natural material of mica or silica. Like this is natural stone. Like it's just not something that's a conglomerate that's been mixed together. And plus just granite doesn't work that way. Certainly doesn't apply to granite. That would be my strongest objection to it. And most of the interesting stuff is granite.
I mean, at the bare minimum, it definitely looks like somebody went out of their way to do something unbelievably difficult and seemingly arbitrary. Otherwise, like, why do you need this hyper precise little cup? Like, it just boggles the mind unless there's some symbolic value in it.
Well,
why you would do that? It's like watching Alex Honnold climb like Half Dome without a rope. Like, why in the world would you do that? Except that it's really hard and awesome.
Yeah. So so this is interesting, right? So this is, I would love to show you the rest of these significant ratios, but this is a very interesting point because I have a video about precision specifically, and one of the interesting things about precision is it's not a well understood topic generally, because precision has a relationship to function. You do not develop precision unless it's too expensive to do, unless you are chasing a functional return on it. And this is at the most, as I mentioned before, this started in the modern world with, naval cannons shooting straighter, and then the development of chronographers and watches that could keep time. So we could then, figure out longitude on a map, because we used to just sail up. It's called running an easting or running a westing, right? We'd know what we'd sail up to the latitude because you could tell what latitude you were, and then you'd just go east or west, because you couldn't determine longitude. It wasn't until we got timepieces accurate enough that you could accurately develop longitude, and we started sailing around diagonally. Like, it's amazing. And so precision, you do it for a function, and that probably the stronger, the silicon industry today, the embedded, like chips, we have these, 5 Newton meter processors we're packing like millions, if not billions, of transistors onto a tiny little footprint. Costs us billions of dollars to develop this capability, but we do it because of this functional return in terms of, efficiency, power footprint, computing power, all these benefits that come from it. But it's extremely expensive to develop. So there's this relationship, and I just don't think these people, whoever built these things, just did the precision for fun. So when you look at what are the precise objects, you have things like vases. You also have things like boxes. And these boxes in particular, I think, were functional. And I think the vases were also functional. a lot of these vases are never designed to stand up this way. You cannot stand them up this way without a stand, but they have these flat lids. And also these lug handles, they if you want to just speculate, like to me, it looks like they could be a cam lock. You could literally put them in and twist it, and it's like a cam lock system. There's resonant properties to these things. They have different. There's lots of avenues of study on these vases that are potentially interesting. Like look at their volume, their internal volume. Were they components in a larger system that was doing something? I don't know. For sure, I think the boxes were. At the end of the day, I think even the sites were, like Old Kingdom sites were probably functional sites. But at the end of the day, it's like they would not have developed this precision and made these things precisely unless they had a functional return. They were doing something. And then once you have a manufacturing system that delivers precision, that's what you get. And I think that explains the precision we see in some of the statues, because they're symbolic, right? I don't think there's an argument to be made that the statues were functional. The obelisks and all that stuff, sure, they could have been functional, but statues, symbolic. And this is the reason why our toasters are really well made today, right? Do our toasters need to be put together so finely with little panel gaps like cars and stuff? No, you don't need to be, but it's just the default of what our manufacturing system delivers. It gets designed on a computer. It's got an output that's within 10,000th of an inch or whatever, and that's what you get. Toast, they don't need to be, but that's just the output for the manufacturing system. So,
is there any functional evidence for residues inside of these, like that?
The box
pointing to the vases, for instance, like that people point to what they could be used for, or the boxes for that matter. Yeah.
So interestingly, recently, I was contacted by Max Zamilov, who's a physicist that taught at Penn State for 8 years. He now does his own research into nuclear fusion with his own company. And late last year in Florida, he just, as you do, happened to have a couple of scanning electron microscopes sitting around in his lounge room. And we went down to Florida and, yeah, as you do, and took a bunch of vase fragments and looked at them under an SEM. It's super interesting. And I actually have some other pieces as well that I want to look, because there is one I've got, like, looks like something's happened on the inside of the vase, like it's been eroded or something. But so we were looking for a bunch of things. So first of all, is there any copper in them? We had 6 or 7 pieces. We spent a couple of days in a scanning electron microscope, and just zero copper anywhere, right? So you would expect to see some, because copper is absolutely part of the stoneworking tool kit for ancient Egyptians, according to the archaeologists. It's also the explanation used for tubular drills, and tubular drills are the first step in making these vases. At the bottom of the vases and plates, you often will find that circular mark from a tubular drill. So we were looking inside those grooves. We have these little fragments that show part of that groove, and we're like deep in there, like looking for fragments of copper. Zero copper anywhere, nothing, zilch, zero. However, we did find some interesting metals. Zinc, zircon, tin, iron, and titanium.
Titanium.
And we found in one piece, and I have a little video. It's going to did a live stream about it, and I'm going to talk about it a bit in this video I'm making now. But we found like a 20 to 30 micron wide, what looks to be a piece of titanium that's just returning pure titanium, not an oxide. Because obviously titanium dioxide and iron oxide exist naturally, and you can see that. Zero, we're just not getting any of the other elemental returns from an oxide. And this, even under that magnification, it looks like a piece of embedded metal in the groove that's been cut.
How common are ores, like pure ores of titanium? Like how
Yeah,
easy?
like when was that developed?
Doesn't
I
exist.
think that's a industrial.
1930s. Yeah. It wasn't.
Okay.
It wasn't. So it was the 1800s. It was even discovered as an element in the first place, and it was not used. It was only started to used in industrial processes outside of laboratories, I think, in the 1930s.
But like when they mine,
natural titanium doesn't exist. The only natural form is titanium dioxide.
and so it's basically a process of refining and smelting and purifying in order to be able to get something that's elemental.
Yep, pure TI return. Yeah.
That's so wild.
Isn't it? Yeah. So look, and I preface this every time I talk about it. It's very early days. This was an initial finding. I'm not sure what to make of it. I have had some conversations with geochemists. I'm going to have some more. We are doing a more systematic search, because we were like 2 days isn't enough to do like a proper search on even one piece of material at like, the
At the magnification that you're working on.
25,000x scale. And that's ongoing, but it's certainly interesting. And I mean, some of the, we see also potential alloys here. We saw iron with titanium in one place, and like mixtures of these metals, and also just individual parts of these metals. And if you've used an SEM, it's interesting when you see metals, they reflect because they bounce back a lot more electrons, same as like quartz crystals sometimes, but you definitely can see metal when it's there. I mean, at the end, we even deliberately contaminated one of these specimens to see like what does that look like. And yeah, sure enough, and we tested it with copper too. We put a copper rod in there and looked at that, and so we were doing what we could to shore up what we were looking at. But I think it's a really interesting avenue of research into these things. That there's really these potentials for it. Who knows? And look, these pieces too. This is like the genuine. The real thing. That's
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask you about, because I'm like, okay, the easiest avenue of attack would be for somebody to say that they're just all planted.
Yeah.
Is that something that people say?
Yes, yes. So the major objection. So this is what drives me a little crazy. Is 'cause one of the best things that we did, and I got to credit Adam Young for this, who's the owner of the OG Vase and the guy who was really the driving force behind trying to get the thing scanned and analyzed. And he's still the driving force today. He started up a non-profit called the Artifact Foundation. He's funding research. Like we were literally in Egypt in December. We're doing several days of research. He spent thousands on private permissions. So we were scanning vase fragments beneath the step pyramid, stuff like that. And he open sourced his results, right? So we scanned it, and I distribute. It's all on my website. If people want to look at the reports, they want to look at the STLs. If you want to look at the models, it's all open sourced. It's on my website, UnchartedX.com. You find vase scan resources. There's a whole page full of this stuff. So people can go and verify this for themselves. Like you can't argue with the data at the end of the day. Like you can verify the precision. You can do Mark Vist's calculations on the radial traversal pattern. You can do all of that yourself. So nobody argues with the data. The skeptics on YouTube that don't like what this means, it seems like, are mostly, frankly, bitching about the fact that some of these vessels don't have like amazing provenance. Like we don't have histories of them beyond, say, the 1960s. Some of them we do, like lots of, and a lot of these are coming from private collections so far. However, like last year, we were in the Petrie Museum. We scanned vases that have impeccable provenance in museums. A lot of the stuff in Matt Bell's collection, one of the guys who's really acquired a lot of these vases.
Matt's going to come on in a couple of weeks too, by the way.
Excellent. Yeah, Matt's great. I was a little frightened when I met his wife for the first time because I thought she'd point at me and go, "You're the guy that's made my husband spend millions of dollars on vases." Because my first video came out, he contacted me. He started buying vases from there, but. No, she's lovely. They're both great people. They're good friends of mine. I love Matt. He does a great job, and he's doing good work in the podcasting space too. But he
and by the way, shout out to Matt for sending us these vases in the first place.
He sent you guys. Perfect. Yeah,
that's where he got these.
He's the man. I mean, all of these ones behind me, he sent me as well. I have most of his collection, or at least the early days of his collection up here. It's great, and he's a very generous guy. He's been a big supporter of mine for a long time, so I'm thankful to him. And but some of his vases also have impeccable provenance. They're precise. Some of the vases in the Petrie Museum, impeccable provenance. They're precise. The whole provenance argument seems to me to be a bit of a distraction away from the data. It's a long discussion. I'll get into it in this upcoming video, but I also think just the suggestion that these are fake when you consider all of the attributes we know about them really doesn't hold up any water, because if the hypothesis would be that, well, these are made in order to sell on the antiquities market for profit. And we know of some of these vases going back to the 1960s or the 1980s. I would question our capability to make them as precisely as we know they have been made in those time periods. I'd also question why you would do it like that in the 1960s. There's no point making them precise. Just get them pumped out in a Chinese or an Indian granite shop and sell them. It's fine. You don't need. It would cost you so much to make them precise. And here's the other thing about these vases. You mentioned this before. They're unadorned. They're just stone vases. There's no writing on them. They've never been that valuable when you're talking about antiquities, real antiquities. They've become quite valuable since my vase videos came out. I know this from antiquities vendors because the price has gone like 4 or 5x. I talked to one guy. He's like, "What is going on? I've had so many phone calls about these vases," and I'm like, "I don't know." Like, and I stupidly, I mean, of course, I get called all sorts of names in this scene as well. I'm a grifter, apparently.
Are you selling vase
lies.
reconstructions?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I don't, and I never got in on the grift of buying vases so I could then pump the price up to sell them later. So I don't actually have any of them myself. But
You're not very good at
grifter.
grifting.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. So I think there's a lot of logical inconsistencies with trying to suggest they're fake, particularly if you consider the precision, the mathematical design behind them. The possibility of even making them that well in the 1960s. Why would you do it? Like, fake antiquities exist, right? But they're usually paintings or tile mosaics or mosaics, however you say that word, things that are easier to replicate. They're worth a lot more money. I mean, these are challenging to make. I just wouldn't think it'd be a target for fakes. I mean, particularly when they're not worth that much.
Does the mainstream just think people were carrying around water in these things, or like what's the ascribed purpose of this unbelievably
oils? Yeah.
Would you expect
perfume oils?
Would you expect to be able to see that on SEM? Any kind of remnants of that?
You might. I mean, I literally have a piece up here that's I can show you. Let me see. Interesting. I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera, but it's like it's eroded. If you look at this end here, it's kind of eroded.
Mm-hmm.
Like something's happened. That's the inside. You can see like the flat. So this is the bottom surface, and it's the curvature. Something's happened to this, and it actually has some dirt and patina on it from where it was found. And it'd be interesting to look at this under an SEM, but you might be able to see if, it's a possibility. We didn't see really too many organic compounds. In fact, one of the takeaways from an SEM work was that they were just remarkably clean altogether. Like you would have expected almost more contamination. We just didn't see any. So I just think it'd be nice if you could start some official support behind doing this, which we're working on, where someone can go collect samples and bag them and like keep them pristine. I mean, it's obvious, these come from like private collectors and people in Egypt.
Do you think that there's still a lot of them that are out in Egypt waiting to just be scooped up? Like they're just still inside of
fragments? Thousands of them. Like literally, it's one of the things you can go down beneath the step pyramid and handle fragments today. Like, and there are literally thousands and thousands of them still down there.
That's crazy.
Like I went down to the deepest level. This is all very special permission stuff. You need to have permission with the Antiquities Department Ministry and pays a bunch of money to get the permission for like 2 hours to go down into. So there's 6-7 miles of tunnels beneath the step pyramid, and that's where a lot of these were found. Right in one place, they found 40 to 50,000 of them. Jean-Philippe Loyer in the 1930s. Excavated there and found them. He wasn't even the first guy excavating down there, but
hold on, like all of this level of precision?
Not all, no.
Okay.
And in fact, that's a statement I should make about all. It's not like all of them are like this. They're often will be mixed in, and particularly there because that's the step pyramid. That was Djoser and Imhotep, so it's mixed in with alabaster stuff that's handmade, and not all. And so this is a result of the data set getting wider. Over time. So there's a good study came out recently looking at like 22 of Matt Bell's scanned vases. And you can kind of break them into two categories where it's like very precise and like less precise. So you sub 10 thousandths of an inch and then above 10 thousandths of it's like an order of magnitude less precise. So some of them are in that category and some of them, and even then it's still what you would consider pretty damn good, like precise. But then there is a subcategory of them that is very precise, like aerospace level precision. So it's not all of them. But if you just were to categorize stone vases in that one place underneath the step pyramid, he pulled out somewhere between 40 and 50,000 in down there. I think there's probably around 100,000, if not more, of them in circulation today. They're not like they're rare. And they, like I said, they've been found in Old Kingdom sites as well as all these pre-dynastic sites. You have rumors. I mean, there's reports from the early 1900s where you might have 1 or 2,000 of these coming out of Saqqara in a single day. Flinders Petrie, when he was collecting his in the late 1800s, part of that was also buying them from vendors on the street that had, they were selling mummies, they were selling vases, they were selling fragments of stuff. So a lot of his stuff came from like local guys that had been digging holes and, selling this stuff. And it's, to some extent, it still goes on today. You can speculate all you want about how Zahi Was made his money, but potentially.
Shots fired.
Shots fired, yeah, well, I've heard stories. I'll leave it there, but I've heard stories. So yeah, there's a lot of them, and yeah, you go down beneath the step pyramid, and there's thousands of fragments. And then I've actually been down to the very bottom levels where they stopped excavating because eventually they dug a hole and they hit the water table, but the tunnels keep going. And we went into an area, and you can't normally get down there, but we got connections, so there's only a couple of us down there, and we went into an area that's like 170 feet under the ground there, and then beneath the pyramid, and then we're in this corner is like a collapsed magazine. It's like the ceiling had collapsed, and it was evidently like a room that was full of these vessels, and literally in the wall, it's like a dirt wall. You could just like pick, and it's like all stratified. It must have collapsed thousands of years ago, but you could pick out fragments of diorite and granite and porphyry, and it's all machined, and it's like fragments of these vases that got smashed in, and it's embedded in the walls. It's quite amazing.
So what fraction of this do you think are the precision machined ones that are representative of this older culture?
Well, all I can go on is the data we have so far, and this will be refined further as the data set increases, but it looks like if you exclude the alabaster stuff, then I would suggest it's probably the order of a third to a half seem to be in that very precise category.
That's great. That's higher than I expected.
Why vases, by the way?
But they had boxes too.
Oh, okay.
Plates, dishes.
They took eating very seriously.
I guess so. Yeah, they wanted some precise stoneware. Yeah, some high-end Michelin-starred places. I guess. I don't know. I don't know why. To me, that seemed to be. We've not done analysis as far as I know on the like plates and dishes and things. They seem to, for the eye, they seem to have a lot of the same characteristics. Really sophisticated machining, things like tapering. So one of the, it's amazing when you see a fragment of a big plate, then you just have this super consistent tapering from thick to thin as the angle changes, and it's just very consistent. I think this is extremely challenging to achieve. Under any circumstance.
Has anybody played with the idea of like the Baghdad battery type situation that they could have been used as some sort of chemical reaction vessel for providing basic electric power? I'm getting really far out, but I don't know. It just seems weird that there's two possibilities, right? Like you either have the technology is developed for some purpose that we don't have an artifact from, and these are just trickle down effects that, hey, why not just make vases because we already have this technology? Or the vases are used for some purpose that we don't understand. And either one of those is really tantalizing. Maybe there's a third possibility too, but maybe they just really liked eating. I don't know.
Could be. My intuition is that I think they were functional. For what I don't know, this is that speculation area. It's like, look, again, I think those answers might be outside of our technological understanding. And so, yeah, the same with the boxes. To be honest, like it's just Chris Dunn actually in his latest book, The Tesla Connection. He had a chapter on. He credits me in it actually. A bit, and I read this book before it came out, and we talked. I sent him some material for this. He wrote a chapter on the Serapeum. The Serapeum is probably my favorite site in all of Egypt. It has 24 of these just gigantic 100-ton stone boxes in this underground labyrinth, and they're all in these alcoves. It's a phenomenal place, and they're just unadorned, perfectly cut sort of precision stone boxes that weigh about 100 tons, and
are they like person-sized boxes, or
no? They're giant. They're literally like 11, 12 feet long on the inside.
What?
And they're 2 feet thick and then 9 feet high, and they've been precisely lowered into the center of these alcoves in a tunnel system that they were also brought into. By the way, the ceiling is not constructed; it's all bedrock, and the biggest boxes is like a foot of clearance between the walls and the size of the box. They still got them in there somehow. Good luck with that. That's a fun logistics challenge for anyone, by the way. But this is why they're still in there, by the way. They're not in museums because we're not getting them out either. Anyway, so he wrote this wonderful chapter looking at like what are the possibilities, and he kind of expanded on this idea that the technological answer to this could be so big we can't see it, or it could be so small we can't see it. I think one of the concepts that's wild, and this is total speculation, but one of the things I like to think about and that I think is a possibility is that all of these sites, that what I call the Sunbelt sites, these old kingdom pyramid sites that are on the west bank of the Nile near Cairo, Abu Rawash and Giza, Saqqara, Abusir, Dashur, Saqqara, Abu Ghurab. There's this whole belt of them, and there's always been rumors that they're connected. To me, I think these could have been functional sites that were used for some sort of industrial purpose. They had a function. If the pyramids had a function, then these underground boxes had a function. I think there's something to the phenomena of massive stone boxes either in the ground or in pyramids, because there's something damn sure happened in that Great Pyramid that we don't understand. I mean, that box is not a box for a person. It's blown up. Like the walls inside the King's Chamber have cumulatively expanded about an inch. Something that Petrie noticed, he talked about it. He's like, if there's like some sort of overpressure event, something happened that they shifted, but they've sort of expanded by the room sort of moved about an inch total. The granite's burnt in there. Like it literally changes color as you come out of the King's Chamber and you're in the antechamber. And if you look at the granite around the corner, it's a different color. Like it's burnt. There's signs of burning at the roof of the Grand Gallery. I mean, and why do you create a freestanding 2,500 ton granite structure inside of a pyramid in the first place? I'm not sure there's any good explanation for it. Like that, people call these chambers above the King's Chamber relieving chambers, but they're not. Like that is essentially a freestanding structure inside the pyramid. There's no weight actually being put on that granite structure other than its own weight, which is total about 2,500 tons of rose granite.
Have you heard this guy Jeffrey Drum's theory about the industrial agriculture stuff?
Yeah, the Land of Chem is his channel.
Yeah, that was fascinating. That was I was not that was a really shocking podcast we did with him. I thought that it was going to be completely loony, and then I just kept getting like more and more pulled into it. Like this is freaking crazy.
He has some good theories. That the chemical plant theories are interesting. I like the idea that there are speculators out there chasing down in different theories. Like Chris Dunn has his theory about the pyramid being a power plant. His theory kind of explains every aspect of the pyramid. His new theory involves a lot of new science, earthquake science, the science behind earthquake lights, a bunch of also stuff related to Tesla that I think is super interesting. I'm really encouraged when people chase down these theories and they seem to hold weight and they stand up to scrutiny, things like that. I don't know. I like to pay attention to them. I don't really have so many of my own really speculative theories. I'm, however, just convinced that the stuff was functional. Now, what that function is, I'm not probably smart enough to come up with my own theories on that, but it's something I'm working on. I do think there's speculation to be made around what this culture might have looked like when they existed and what it means for the rest of us and that type of thing. But yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's this idea that just simple tombs that were made by these butt flap wearing primitives it's dying a very deserved death at this point. I just don't think that holds up to any scrutiny at all. There's very little evidence for it. And whether or not you think that the dynastic Egyptians are responsible for everything we see in Egypt, or you think it was another culture, I think the evidence is such that it requires at this point a rewriting of history. We have to account for the technological evidence that we are seeing, which in the case of the dynastic Egyptians, if you think they did it, then we need to drastically revisit our understanding of their culture and their capabilities, because it far exceeds the current version of them that we think of.
So do you see your role as that of a theorist, or do you see yourself more as the person who's going and organizing the best collection of reliable pointers? Or both?
Probably more of the latter. I feel like a lot of what I do. I mean, I have my own theories. So I do have like things like the Tale of Two Industries. I that's something that I'm building on, and that I sort of would credit myself with. But I definitely report on and I summarize a lot of the other work, because the whole reason I got into this in the first place was that it seemed to me that a lot of this really interesting information at the time, this is back in say 2014, 2015, like this information is buried in books. It's buried in, these tomes, and this information, you have to be really deeply involved and interested to read all these books and to collect this information. I didn't feel like a lot of that had yet been pulled out and sort of presented in a new media fashion. Like originally I was like, let's make a documentary. And I'm like, turns out I didn't know anything about the film world or how to make documentaries, because that's actually the film world. And then you end up on YouTube. All right. That's just what happens. And, so yeah, the intent was to try and take a lot of these theories and information and present it to a broader audience in a new media fashion, and that's what it was. It coincided with the rise of like consumer grade 4K stabilized video equipment, which was nice. And at the time when I started putting stuff out, nobody had really done that sort of high production value stabilized views of stuff. There's a lot of shaky cam, steady cam stuff, and then you had to jump up to like, Fox or NBC documentaries that are an hour long, and they just try to cover the whole thing. And now I can spend an hour just talking about tube drills. So, yeah.
Hell yeah.
Thank God for the internet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and we also got into this in a failed documentary. We after we
really?
Yeah, we like finished our PhDs in New York, and then we didn't know what the hell we wanted to do, so we drove around the country, and we decided we were really interested in this idea of worker ownership. So how businesses could, corporations even can run in a situation where there's no shareholders, essentially. And we just had our phones. We had really bad audio. It was ultimately the audio that did us in, but it's kind of sad because we interviewed all these people and we just lost it all.
It was bad.
Yeah.
It was bad. It was not 4K. It was not
That's how you
4K
learn.
level production.
Yeah. No, I did something similar. Like we were like, all right, let's get some cameras and let's spend it. We just spent like, me and a friend of mine, we spent like a year and a half just traveling around filming everything. It was a great time, but then it's like, all right, what do we do with this? How do we make a documentary? It's like, no, yeah.
What happened to all that footage?
No, I use it. I use it all the time. Like I literally some of the footage from 2016. For some reason, when I was there, it was like either just after the Arab Spring. There wasn't many tourists there, so a lot of that footage is just solo me and say Yusuf, for just we were at places where there's very few tourists. And then over the years since then, when I started, because every year I do like an Egypt tour, people were at me for years to like, how do we go to Egypt and see this with you? Originally, it was just, I'm just going to do these special permissions, because I can't afford to spend 5,000 or 6,000 every time I want to go beneath the step pyramid. But if you bring a group of 30 or 40 people with you, you can spread the cost out. Everyone gets to experience it. I get to do some research and some filming. Everyone wins. And so that was the driver behind tours in the first place, was to do special permissions. And over the years, we've actually developed I have really good people in Egypt, and they have good relationships with the ministry. And we've actually created special permissions to get into places that nobody had been into before. And so that's been good footage. And I even traveled during COVID. Like I went in 2020. We were like the only Western tour group there at the time. Just after they reopened, it was great. It was, from a site visit perspective, there was nobody there. Like we had this unique time in Egypt where there was very few tourists. And after the pandemic ended, I think the pent up demand for tourism had that place running at like 115% for the next couple of years. It's been super busy in Egypt, but you can navigate it if you have the right contacts and things. So it's been interesting. It's fun though. I love that place now. I've been probably, I don't know, 12 or 15 times or something now. I really like Egypt.
Yeah, we need to make it out there for sure. I kind of got my eyes on 2027 because there's supposed to be an eclipse out there in Cairo in 27.
Well, Luxor. Yeah.
Oh, is it Luxor? All right, sorry. I don't
get
know
that question a lot.
the head from the tail. I'm sorry.
Well, that's Upper Egypt. It's also, I believe, in July.
Yes,
So it depends on
there's
how much you enjoy 125 degrees.
I noticed you had some sweat on your brow in some of those shots.
Dude, it's hot. I go in winter, it's still hot, and Upper Egypt gets super hot, and it's more like Lower Egypt is in the north, Upper Egypt in the south, northern hemisphere, so it's a bit closer to the equator. So Upper Egypt gets crazy hot, and at places like Karnak and Luxor, where people are going to be, if that eclipses during the middle of the day, which I think it is, I'm actually concerned that there'll be people passing out from heat stroke, because those temples, the reflected heat on this from everything stone, it's really, even in the winter, it's hot, like it's 100 degrees, 95 degrees, and
Good to know.
during summer, well, I'm not going. Everyone's like, "Are you going to go to Luxor for the eclipse?" I'm like, "Hell no! I've been to Egypt in the summer. I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that again." Like I just my personal perspective on that is it'll be really hot, and it will also be very, very crowded in Luxor for the eclipse.
I believe it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we only have a few minutes left. Do you have anything you want to wrap on?
Not really. Yeah, I mean, there's such rabbit holes, and you've you've got so much work on your channel. There's obviously academic papers to follow up on. This is the first time that we've talked to anybody about these things too, and I know we have a conversation coming up with Matt, so we'll probably keep learning more. And it's just the tip of the iceberg for us, really.
I could leave you. I could do one quick little more like technical kind of tidbit on the vases, if you like on the pi and the phi that's in there. Did you?
Yeah. Let's do it.
You guys know that? So let me find it real quick. I know I do have it here. Maybe
so something that I always wonder about with mathematical analyses is I would love to see a similar analysis done on an object that is not made to encode mathematical relationships, but just appears beautiful.
Yes, I would also. And again, I don't think you'd end up, I mean, I haven't seen it done. My intuition would suggest that you're not going to end up with the same level of mathematical design just
wouldn't it be crazy if you did, though?
Yeah, I don't think you would. Not when you might by accident see things like pi, phi encoded in it, like just in the ratios, even 1 or 2 degrees of interrelationship. But when you talk about 12 to 15, like perfectly interrelated levels of just levels of interrelationship, like it's 15 levels deep, and literally they're tightly correlated. Whereas if one of those levels didn't fit, it would throw everything else off, and none of it would fit. I just don't think that's possible. That it's by accident. I don't think there's any other explanation for that other than it was intentional. And in fact, Mark Vist says this quite well. He said it would be entirely more likely for you to wake up with a wholly new universe sprouting out of your left nostril due to quantum fluctuations than for this to be, a coincidence, like just a random occurring of chance. And I agree with him just because of the depth of interrelationships that we see here. I think that's
and even to capture that natural beauty, like if you look at people like Da Vinci, like he's doing these studies and trying to find these mathematical ratios so that he can create better representations of the natural world in the first place. So it's like he's encoding that knowledge for himself using mathematics in order to reproduce it more accurately, because you see these ratios throughout the human body as well, but you have to really study them and codify them mathematically in order to reproduce them, because people really, I don't know if you've seen medieval art of people's bodies and stuff.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah.
I mean, yes. I agree. I agree. I think that there's something that is delicate and intentional here. I just also have this sneaking suspicion about beauty and mathematics.
Yeah.
That they're somehow related.
You may be right. In fact, the funny thing is that the radial traversal pattern actually also is the same. I believe it's the same ratio as the harmonic scale. Like it's the same sort of step as a harmonic scale, which is a whole other thing. Robert Edward Grant actually has a theory where he's found the same ratio. It seems like in comparing the slope angles of the pyramids. There's some interesting correlations that I'm looking at this next year, but the fact that we see this very, very tightly interrelated mathematical system on multiple, like 15 degrees of interrelationship, and we see it in multiple vessels. It, to me, is really indicative that this is a design. It may well be an insight into their mathematical system altogether, like a particular system of design. In fact, there's other indications of that when you dive into this, and I'll just quickly run you through this. If you look at this, so this is how those ratios are kind of defined in the vases. This is a couple of examples, pi and phi. So, for example, you get pi if you divide the diameter of the opening, this red line, over the radius of the internal opening here, the diameter of the outer lip over the radius of the internal opening. That is pi, 3.14, to within 0.1%, approximately 32 microns. And then here's phi squared. So if you divide the diameter of the neck, which is this red line here, over the radius of the internal opening, you get phi squared. And you can extend that to, I believe, if you divide the radius of the foot of the vase, the bottom of the vase, over the radius of the internal opening, you get pi over phi squared to within less than 0.1%. Now, what's interesting, you see this over and over again. There's actually a whole number of these interrelationships with each other here, and I just want to bring up this one little note that I've got on this section here, which is to say that because that radius of the internal opening, we can actually express that now as both a function of pi and of phi. So it's this like double equivalency. If I go equivalency, where are you? Equivalency. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Double. Yes, here we go. So if you have that radius of the internal opening, and it's in both, you can express in both terms of pi and phi. So what Mark did was one of these things that he assumed. He's like, what if we took that opening and we assumed that was like their the one base unit in terms of the design, like this radius, which happens to be 18.739 millimeters. Let's assume that's a 1, and that makes everything really, really clean, because if you go with that, and it sort of exposes that these ratios are in this thing. So, the maximum diameter of the lip, if you like, is pi base units. The minimum neck diameter is phi squared base units. The radius of the foot of the vase becomes pi over phi squared base units. The radius of the internal opening is 1 base unit. And the interesting thing about that number that he also figured out, and this is, again, pure speculation, you can kind of make of it what you will. This number, 18.739 millimeters, it's actually exactly the wavelength of a 16 gigahertz electromagnetic wave traveling in a vacuum, like 16.0, like no 16 with digits behind it, which means that the base unit, if indeed that's what it is like a whole number subdivision of the speed of light. Whatever, right? So it's just interesting. Like, it's just you get round numbers when you do this, and it's like you would expect if it was arbitrary, it's a much higher chance that it would be 16 point whatever. It'd be like this. You'd have decimal points, but it's basically perfectly exactly the wavelength of a 16 gigahertz.
It's extraordinary, and it comes back to precision, right? Because it's not that it's like almost pi. It's not that it's almost phi squared. You're like, no. It's like several decimal points of it.
Yes, within a few microns, basically, with under 0.01% most of the time. Like, that's hard to do accidentally. Right.
The speed of light thing is crazy. What do you think there's a significance to 16 gigahertz? Like,
well, it's a very significant frequency range that we use today, is all I can say. It's used extensively with satellite communications, but it's just a whole number subdivision of the speed. Like, it's a connection to it, and to me, it's possibly more encoded information that tells them. Like, it's why I think phi is so significant. It's not just that there is the golden ratio in the vase. I don't even know if there is. What you're seeing is phi squared and pi over phi squared, and phi being an element in this significant ratio. And there's a longer list of them. Same for the other two vases. You see pi and phi turning up, but just the fact that phi is sort of encoded makes me think that this is like it's a basis for their design system that's a harmonic with the universe, because it is such a fundamental constant in the universe. It's
It does
how the
kind of
universe
point to, like,
expresses itself.
if it's not just a coincidence, it could point to them just understanding the wave nature of light
Yeah.
in some sense. I mean, if you think of the way that like lasers and microwave ovens are designed, they also are, or even antenna, they're tuned to the length of waves in order to be maximally efficient absorbers and emitters. So, I mean, who the heck knows, but
Yeah,
it would make sense.
Yeah,
So-
you get resonance and standing waves are a big part of a lot of these artifacts and objects. I mean, you can create a standing wave in a concrete water tank if you want to. You find the right frequency, but there seems to be elements of some of the older stone designs that help to create standing waves. Like there's like what I call resonance chambers on the Giza Plateau that have these false door shapes that have these wave fronts on them, and that seems to greatly aid in creating a standing wave when you sit in there. You can literally stand in these small chambers in one corner and you hum in your chest, you get the right frequency, and the whole room just seems to vibrate. It's really cool. But everything has that property, right? If, like I said, a concrete water tank has that property. An empty room couldn't have that property. But it seems like they were definitely trying to help it along. And and that false door shape is one of the oldest forms from ancient Egypt. And it's one that was revered throughout their ages, and they would replicate it. They would draw it on things, but the actually hard-coded three-dimensional versions of that exist from the very earliest times.
So who made this stuff?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's humans. I think it was us. I think the Egyptians do have a cultural memory of them. There's probably these people during the Zep Tepi times, whatever they describe as Zep Tepi, and I definitely think that they went through a cataclysm and they were forced to start again, which again matches their own origin stories and myth, what we call myth and legend. Although they make no such distinction, they call it history, but we call it myth and legend. Their own origin stories. I think it was humans. I think it was a more advanced civilization than the known existing advanced civilizations. I think it was one that was different to us. And who knows, potentially spacefaring at that point. There's actually some evidence that points towards that as well, if you want. That's like the crazy speculation angle, but there may even be indications of that in places like Dendera in Egypt that seem to physically depict like solar boats going up to the moon and things like that. So,
All right, I got to work my way up to that one, but But I love this stuff.
Plenty more behind it. It's fun.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting and a lot to think about. And I think that you're spot on about there being a huge fraction of history that we just have no idea about, and anomalous artifacts that show up in places where they're not supposed to be, carried by people that can't make them, is kind of the best possible evidence.
Yeah, and it seems like you're going about this the right way, doing these really careful studies of it, just inventorying the anomalous features of the record in a way that might take us centuries to unravel at this point.
I'm really excited to find out what you see at the museum when you go.
Yes, that'll be interesting. Like I said, we've been to the Petrie Museum. That the cliff notes is yes, there are vessels in there that are in that very precise category. The actual analysis all takes time and is ongoing. We have a foundation, essentially a non-profit, that's putting all this together now at this point, and we will be collecting and releasing a lot more data, and there's some legitimacy and institutional interest between in it now. We have appointments at other museums, and we are working on kind of the holy grail access to vases and things as well that hopefully will happen in the coming year. So we'll get there. I mean, it's always been the intention to take a scientific approach to this and to see where the data leads us. And I'm glad to be playing a part in it. I mean, it's not me that is doing it so much as I'm a part of it and I'm reporting on it. I guess I'm to some extent the external face for it, but it's really guys like Adam Young, Matt Bell and Carolee Poker, guys that are doing the actual scientific work and driving that stuff that should get a lot of the credit for this, because I'm kind of reporting on it and participating in it, but it's been really good because the response and the fact that this got out there is the reason that people like Matt Bell and Mark Vist and other interested, intelligent, talented people get involved in it from around the world. And my favorite part of it, honestly, has been the open source kind of crowdsourcing nature of a lot of this research. It's been great. Like so many people have, Max Zamolov, this scientist, physicist in Florida, was scanning electron microscopes, sees it, and comes out of the woodwork, and we get to look at pieces in a SEM. It's fantastic.
And it just seems like so much more of a productive approach to actually go and figure this stuff out than waiting around, or complaining about the academy and why, everybody understands who's worked in the academy that things get bogged down, paradigms get stuck. But like, this is the way to do it, folks. Like, get out there, organize, and just don't wait for the academics to catch up. There's a lot of work you can do when you put your heads together. I think you're an awesome lighthouse for how that should work with all these other sciences that we explore on the show too. So I appreciate your work.
Yeah, dude. Thank you so much. Yeah, I enjoyed speaking with you. And hopefully, yeah, I hope it continues. I would love nothing. I don't have anything against the archaeologists and the Egyptologists. I understand the nature of and the dangers of stepping outside of kind of the dogma and the doctrines. But I mean, I've been contacted privately by particularly students, but also some Egyptologists and archaeologists that are like, there's something to this, but they can't step out. So I hope eventually there's a paradigm shift here, because I think one of the things they've been faced with is they're losing a bit of relevance. I know that the SAA, Society of American Archaeology, and some of these academics, they know that there's people are doing an end run around academics in this field, at least a little bit, with the internet and with the books and stuff that are coming out. And I think they're in a little bit of danger of losing some relevance. I'd love to see them become more multidisciplinary, embrace some of the new ideas, even if it is to just throw them out eventually. That's part of the process. Things need to stand up to scrutiny. But just to stop sort of hanging on, I feel like they've got this death grip on this story of history, and they're not going to let it go. Part of things like civilization started 6,000 years ago, damn it. Not even Göbekli Tepe changed that. That's still, they just changed the definition of what it means to be a hunter-gatherer. So I hope, whether or not was it Planck's constant, or Planck's theorem, science advances one funeral at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I like that as Planck's constant.
It's just, hopefully it doesn't take generational change, but I would just love to see them embrace and open up a bit more to some of the evidence coming from other disciplines of science, essentially.
I think we're watching something new get born. I think that institutions die. They grow old. They get calcified and decrepit. And I think that eventually maybe some of them, Oxford and Cambridge and the Royal Society have been around for hundreds of years. And I assume that they'll figure out how to reinvent themselves for the future. But I think that what you're doing and what we're doing is pointing towards what comes next. It's like there's a world of people that are responsible, curious, passionate, and just doing it. And people seem to like it.
Yeah, it's great. Yes, I love what you guys are doing too. And yeah, I mean, thanks for having me on. It's been really fun actually diving into this stuff.
Oh man, we're super grateful. I mean, you obviously you were a much smaller channel than you. You had no good reason to do this other than curiosity and
and the goodness of your heart. Yeah,
spirit of progress. So yeah, we're super thankful. But yeah, man, cool. Good luck. Cool. We'll be paying attention. We'll be in the audience. So
awesome.
Yeah. Have a great rest of your night, man. And thank you again.
Cheers.